the invisible origin of the empire. In the heart of Anatolia, long before the word Ottoman meant anything to Europe, before cannons thundered beneath the walls of Constantinople, before maps were forced to be redrawn by sultans and viziers, there was silence. A deep silence, the kind that lingers only when one empire has collapsed and another has yet to begin. At the beginning of the 13th century, the old Seljuk power was crumbling, and chaos spread across the Anatolian peninsula like a plague with no cure. Mongols on one side, Christian kingdoms on the other, and in between, Turkmen tribes, nomads hardened by the elements, searching for a place to take root, or at least resist. It was in that fractured land, halfway between the Byzantine frontier and the remnants of the Islamic world, that the most unlikely figure emerged. A man named Osman. Not a sultan, not a king, not a trained general. A tribal chief, barely acknowledged by others, though his descendants would turn him into legend. His true story is lost between the chants of dervishes and documents that were never written. What we do know is that Osman belonged to the Kai tribe, one of many branches of the great Turkmen tree that scattered after the fall of Seljuk power. Like many others, this tribe wandered through the mountains, driven more by necessity than ambition, following an uncertain fate. The settlement of Söğüt, in the northwest of Anatolia, was nothing more than a village with an adobe mosque, a dusty market, and roads that dissolved in the rain. Yet this village had something no other did: position. From there one could look directly at the Byzantine Empire, a tired giant, draped in old gold, no longer able to defend its own borders. For a frontier chief like Osman, that was an open invitation, not so much to conquest as to opportunistic raiding. But what made Osman different was not his strength, nor even his boldness, but something far more difficult to define, a vision that seemed to come from elsewhere. Ottoman tradition tells that Osman had a dream, not just any dream, but one of those that define a civilization. In it, he saw a crescent moon rise from his chest and settle in the sky. Then, from that moon grew a massive tree whose roots extended to the four corners of the world. The branches covered mountains, rivers, and cities, and beneath its shade lived people of all languages. This tree, the mystics said, was the future empire, and Osman was its seed. Most likely, this story was constructed much later, when his descendants had already conquered half the world. But that does not make it any less powerful. Dreams, after all, are the invisible maps empires use to justify their past. And in the case of the Ottomans, that dream became the foundation of their spiritual legitimacy. Osman, transformed into a secular prophet, appeared as the one chosen by God to establish a new order in a land of chaos. In practical terms, what Osman did was take advantage of the power vacuum around him. He attacked minor Byzantine fortresses, occupied poorly defended frontier towns, and offered protection to peasants, both Muslim and Christian, in exchange for loyalty. The key to his success was simple but brilliant. Do not destroy everything he found, but absorb it. The Christian populations, mostly Greeks and Armenians, were not seen as enemies to be eradicated, but as potential subjects. That hybrid and flexible way of ruling would become a lasting hallmark of the Ottoman system for centuries. Osman's small principality began to expand like wildfire, not with massive armies or epic battles. It was more of an infiltration, where each victory strengthened his aura and allowed him to attract more Ghazi warriors, fighters who battled not just for loot, but for the glory of spreading Islam in infidel lands. These men, half nomads and half mystics, were essential in turning the principality into a body with a soul. There were no state institutions as one might imagine in a European kingdom. What existed was charisma, tribute, loyalty, family networks, and above all, a narrative that was already taking shape. The Ottomans were different. They had a destiny. That destiny began to take a more concrete form when Orhan, Osman's son, inherited command. But before reaching him, it is worth pausing at the ambiguous nature of Osman himself. Some even question his existence as a concrete historical figure. Some historians argue that his name may have been a generic symbol of tribal power, or even a later reconstruction. The truth is that, with or without a verifiable body, Osman represents an idea. And at the origin of every empire, ideas weigh more than provable facts. The initial expansion of the principality was not spectacular in terms of territory, but it was decisive. With patience and a sense of timing, Osman forged relationships with other Turkmen leaders, confronted rival clans, and knew when to advance and when to retreat. His ability to read the ever-shifting political map was perhaps his greatest talent. In a world where loyalty lasted as long as a single battle, he managed to build longer-lasting alliances based on mutual usefulness. All of this, of course, without abandoning the spiritual character of his struggle. Because for him and his men, conquest was not just a military act, it was a divine manifestation. In its early years, the Ottoman territory was more of a network than a structure. A collection of enclaves bound by oaths, tribute, and shared symbols. There was not yet a complex state apparatus, but there was a nucleus. The figure of the Bey as political, military, and spiritual leader, upheld by custom, honor, and victory. And around that nucleus, like an expanding constellation, emerged villages, roads, markets, fortresses, and mosques. Little by little, without the world noticing, a new order was being born. By the year 1320, the Ottoman presence was already recognized, feared in some regions and respected in others. It was not yet an empire, not even a real threat to Byzantium, but the rhythm was clear. What began as a marginal tribe on the edge of the Islamic world had transformed into a dynamic, focused force, guided by a combination of mysticism, pragmatism, and hunger for expansion. Time had begun to play in their favor, and the silence in which they were born would soon be replaced by the echo of their footsteps on the stones of fallen empires. In this opening chapter, we have descended to the deepest roots of the Ottoman Empire, where history barely leaves a trace, and where legends intertwine with politics to form a lasting identity. What follows now is the unfolding. Because where there was a seed, there will soon be a branch, and where there was a branch, there will soon be shade. Now, the story moves forward, and with it comes the turn of the second chapter. The rise among Byzantine ruins. The old empire that had once cast its shadow over the eastern Mediterranean was unraveling, not with a bang, but with a long, exhausted sigh. The Byzantine Empire, worn down by centuries of wars, internal schisms, and palace betrayals, continued to exist more out of inertia than true power. Its fortresses still stood, its churches still echoed with liturgies in Greek, and maps still bore its name in golden ink. But beneath it all, beneath the abandoned roads and the provinces where no one obeyed imperial orders anymore, reality told a different story. A cracked marble giant, incapable of stopping the claws that were slowly beginning to scratch at its edges. In that crumbling landscape, the Ottomans did not advance like noisy invaders, but rather like an underground river that moves forward with patience. Osman had laid the foundations, but it was his son Orhan who took that small frontier principality and transformed it into something denser, more structured, more recognizable as a political entity with clear ambitions. It was no longer just about conquering villages. It was time to build something lasting. And to do that, cities were needed. The jewel that would mark the beginning of this transformation was Bursa. In the year 1326, after a prolonged and diplomatically calculated siege, Orhan achieved the unthinkable, taking a Byzantine city of real importance. Bursa was no ordinary village. For centuries, it had been a strategic stronghold, a commercial hub between Asia Minor and the Balkans. Its fall was not just military, it was symbolic. the Ottoman Empire, still in formation, was appropriating Byzantine infrastructure for the first time. Its buildings, its markets, its bureaucracy, and began transforming it from within, with a unique blend of pragmatic tolerance and cultural reform. There, in Bursa, the first true Ottoman capital was established. Shops filled with Turkish, Greek, Jewish, and Armenian merchants. The streets began to see the presence of Islamic judges, Janissary soldiers, architects dreaming up mosques with never-before-seen domes. Orhan did not behave like a brutal conqueror. He understood that to keep what had been gained, he had to offer order. And in those lands accustomed to chaos, order was a kind of redemption. It was also during his reign that the first Ottoman coins were minted, bearing Arabic inscriptions that proclaimed Orhan's authority as a legitimate ruler. The act of minting currency was more than an economic gesture. It was a declaration of sovereignty. The coins circulated among farmers and merchants, carrying the face of the new power, and with them came a silent but powerful presence. The Ottoman state was no longer just a collection of armed tribes. It was beginning to present itself as a complete system, with symbols, laws, and structures that would endure. Another of Orhan's great achievements was institutionalizing the figure of the Qadi, the Islamic judge who governed civil life according to religious law. This did not mean the blind imposition of Islam, but the construction of a legal framework that worked as a tool of cohesion. Christian communities were not expelled nor forced to convert. They kept their temples, their religious hierarchies, even their own internal laws, as long as they recognized the authority of the new order. This policy of controlled coexistence, later misinterpreted by many Europeans as disguised fanaticism, was, in fact, one of the secrets behind centuries of Ottoman stability. Territorial expansion continued westward. In the year 1356, the Ottomans crossed the Dardanelles Strait and captured the city of Gallipoli. It was the first time they set formal foot on the European continent, and they did so through a combination of opportunity and cunning. An earthquake had weakened the walls, and Orhan, far from seeing it as a divine sign, read it for what it was: a breach opened by nature, ripe for history to exploit. From Gallipoli, new campaigns into Thrace would be launched, and with each advance, the empire's borders stopped being a line and became a network. Military success did not rely solely on the strength of arms. An administrative system was beginning to take shape, one that did not depend on the will of a single man. Rudimentary tax records were created, communication routes were established, and most importantly, a bureaucratic apparatus began to form, functioning with enough efficiency to hold together highly diverse territories. It was a power that combined the sword and the word, prayer and logistics. To all of this, a crucial phenomenon was added: fame. The Ottomans were already a topic of conversation in the Balkan courts, in Italian cities, and in Orthodox monasteries of Macedonia. People spoke of them as a force that advanced without stopping, that offered stability where there had once been banditry, that absorbed peoples instead of annihilating them. This reputation was not always positive, but it served its purpose: to inspire respect, fear, and often surrender without battle. Orhan also knew how to weave unexpected alliances. His son, for example, married a Byzantine princess, daughter of Emperor John VI Cantacuzene. That marriage, as symbolic as it was practical, spoke of the balance the Ottomans knew how to strike from the very beginning. They were not building an empire on the total destruction of the previous world. They were building it upon its ruins, incorporating them, reinterpreting them, using them as scaffolding for something new. That capacity for adaptation was one of the most remarkable qualities of this first stage. Instead of erasing the past, they embraced it. From the first mosques built in Greek architectural style to the judicial systems that functioned alongside Christian churches, everything indicated that the Ottomans did not simply want to occupy space. They wanted to inhabit it with purpose. The empire that was growing was not uniform, nor purely Islamic, nor strictly Turkish. It was an amalgam, a mosaic, a promise of order in a fragmented world. By the time Orhan died, people no longer spoke of a tribal leader from Söğüt, but of a respected sultan, recognized from the shores of the Sea of Marmara to the hills of the Balkans. The transition had begun. The small principality had given way to an entity capable of projecting power beyond its immediate borders. The most surprising thing is that all of this happened without spectacular wars, without battles etched in history books as decisive. It was a conquest through persistence, through governance, through seizing the collapse of others and filling it with structure. This rise among Byzantine ruins was not an explosion. It was a patient construction, like someone rebuilding a collapsed house using the same stones from the wreckage. With every recovered village, with every managed city, with every treaty signed, the Ottoman world grew. Not with dramatics, not with shouting, but with the certainty of those who know they have come to stay. And so, with foundations now firmly planted on 2 continents, a new stage begins. One in which expansion would no longer be just a goal, but a way of existence. An unstoppable force that would feed on everything it encountered along its path. Faith and the sword as law. In the land of frontiers, where Islam stared directly into the eyes of Orthodox Christianity and dusty roads connected ruined castles with adobe villages, strength alone was not enough. Something more was needed. A justification. An ideal that would ignite men and give them a cause greater than mere looting or tribal defense. And that cause, in the emerging Ottoman world, was called Gaza. It was a word laden with history and ambiguity, translated as holy war, but understood by the men of that era as a blend of spiritual duty, territorial ambition, and personal glorification. The Ghazi warriors were more than just soldiers. They were believers with swords, men who slept under the stars, who crossed frozen rivers to assault Byzantine towers in the name of a cause greater than themselves. They were not monks, but neither were they simple mercenaries. They were agents of destiny, executors of the divine plan in a land marked by decay. That ideal is what made the Ottomans something different. While other Turkmen tribes scattered, fought among themselves, or wore themselves out in meaningless wars, the followers of the Osman dynasty began to attract these warriors like an invisible magnet. The reputation they had earned through early victories, their pragmatism with conquered peoples, and the cunning with which they handled both the Quran and the sword, earned them respect among the faithful and fear among their enemies. Wherever they appeared, the frontier moved. At this stage, faith was not a decorative institution nor a retroactive excuse. It was the core around which everything revolved. Every military campaign was interpreted as part of a sacred mission. Battles were seen as decisions of God, and conquests as signs of divine favor. This sense of predestination infused the soldiers, the leaders, the religious judges, and the poets who sang of their feats. Ottoman Islam was not yet a refined bureaucratic system or an academic theology, but it already presented itself as a unifying force, a web of shared beliefs capable of crossing regions and cultures. And it was in this environment, filled with fervor and expansion, that one of the most unsettling and powerful institutions of the empire emerged, the devshirme. Sometime during the 14th century, possibly under the rule of Murad I, this practice arose that would forever change how the Ottomans conceived power and control. It consisted of the systematic collection of Christian boys from the Balkans, especially from peasant families, who were taken far from their homes, converted to Islam, and trained from childhood to become servants of the Sultan. Not slaves, not ordinary soldiers, but something new, something unique, the Janissaries. This system, which may seem brutal, and indeed it was also extraordinarily effective. The empire, by drawing from the children of its conquered provinces, created a military class loyal exclusively to the throne, disconnected from tribal struggles, without blood ties to the traditional elites. The Janissaries lived in barracks, were indoctrinated with iron discipline, and were educated in both arms and sciences. They could not marry or own property. Their lives were consecrated to service, and through that sacrifice, an elite was forged, capable of toppling entire kingdoms. The Devshirme was a tool of control, but also a symbol of the Ottoman project in its essence, to absorb diversity, transform it from within, and turn it into the engine of the state. Many of these children, taken from the mountains of Albania or the villages of Serbia, rose to occupy the highest positions: viziers, diplomats, generals who shaped history. The empire not only conquered territories, it conquered bodies, languages, and mentalities. It was a system that manufactured loyalty with surgical precision. But power was not sustained by soldiers alone. Judges, scholars, and administrators were also needed. And this is where Islam as law came into play. The Sharia, Islamic law, was not enforced with indiscriminate cruelty, but with a logic that provided structure. It was more than a religious code. It was an adaptable legal framework that allowed local communities to follow certain of their own norms while respecting the central authority. Christians and Jews were considered dhimmi, protected people, required to pay a special tax but free to maintain their customs. This coexistence was not free from tensions, but it worked better than many contemporary models. It was imperfect, yes, but functional. In conquered cities, the construction of mosques marked victory, but so did the markets, public baths, and fountains. Ottoman power presented itself as a reorganization of space, a new way of living the urban experience. Faith was not only doctrine, it was architecture, music, law, and calendar. The calls to prayer blended with local languages, and little by little, the empire began to sound like a single voice, even if it was made up of many accents. At this point, the role of the Sultan was no longer merely that of a military leader. He was seen as the shadow of God on earth, a figure who embodied the union of the spiritual and the political. His legitimacy came not only from conquest, but from ruling in accordance with divine will. This sacred character of the throne would be an essential element in the centuries to come, because in the end, the most enduring power is the one perceived as inevitable. All this happened as the map continued to shift. The Balkans became a constant battlefield, where castles fell without anyone able to defend them. In Anatolia, the ancient Seljuk cities were being integrated into the new order. Ottoman expansion seemed to have no end, not because it advanced with uncontrolled violence, but because it did so with a clear purpose, supported by solid structures and a religious conviction that infused every gesture. The enemies of the empire, for their part, were beginning to realize that they were not facing a passing force. European chronicles started to describe the Ottomans not as mere invaders, but as a new kind of state, with a military and legal system that seemed strangely efficient. Alliances began to form. Crusades were reactivated, but everything seemed to come too late. The rhythm of the advance was already unstoppable. From a broader perspective, one can understand that the Ottoman Empire did not grow solely because of its military prowess or political cunning. Its initial expansion was possible because it offered a comprehensible and stable framework in a world where disorder had long been the norm. Its system of government, however brutal it may seem in some respects, offered predictability. And in those turbulent centuries, that predictability was a form of hope. Thus, we reach the end of a stage where sword and faith were not opposites, but companions on the path. A stage where cities were organized with minarets on the horizon and oaths sworn under the crescent moon. But what is coming will demand even more determination, because the empire, strengthened by its system, is about to enter a much more complex phase, one in which the European kingdoms will begin to look with genuine concern at what they had once believed to be merely a distant threat. The conquest of the Balkans. When the Ottoman Empire finally crossed into Europe, it was not met with the attention it deserved. The Christian kingdoms were busy with their own disputes, dynastic wars, and fragile alliances that shattered with the ease of thin glass. Meanwhile, from the east, a different kind of structure was advancing, patient, quiet, and cohesive. A force that had not yet declared itself a global empire, but already possessed something its enemies had begun to lose: direction. Murad I, son of Orhan, came to power at a decisive moment. He inherited a growing state, with both feet in Anatolia and an arm stretched over Thrace. His task was not merely to continue the expansion. What he did was to institutionalize the advance, to give it form, to ensure that every step echoed with political and military weight. In many ways, that made him the true architect of the Ottoman expansion into the Balkans. The first thing he did was consolidate power in Eastern Europe. The strategic base was Edirne, formerly Adrianople, taken by the Ottomans and transformed into their European capital. From there, future operations were planned. Orders were dispatched to the Cadis, logistical routes were organized, and armies were stationed. Edirne was more than a forward outpost. It was a symbol. The capital of Islam on Christian soil, a direct message to the rest of Europe about what was at stake. The expansion did not occur wildly or haphazardly. It was meticulous, woven with diplomacy, calculated violence, and a deep understanding of the region. The Balkans were fragmented, a patchwork of principalities in constant dispute: Serbia, Bulgaria, Wallachia, Hungary. And among them, minor lords, isolated castles, fortresses commanded by leaders who switched allegiances with the shifting political winds. In that context, the Ottomans offered something different: a vertical power structure, a promise of stable order, even if it came clad in the Crescent. The early campaigns were swift and effective. Fortresses fell, sometimes by assault, sometimes through negotiated surrender. In many cases, local leaders preferred to strike deals with the Ottomans rather than risk betrayal by their own allies. Murad knew when to apply pressure and when to offer a truce. He used Islam as justification, but he was not a hostage to orthodoxy. He allowed Christian populations to keep their churches and local nobles to retain some of their privileges, so long as they pledged loyalty and paid tribute. One of the keys to the advance was the refinement of the vassalage system. Defeated lordships became subjects of the Sultan, maintaining a degree of local autonomy, but their armies were compelled to join Ottoman campaigns. This not only weakened their capacity to rebel, but added military muscle to the state. In this way, the empire grew not only by annexation, but through absorption. But the moment that would forever alter Europe's perception of Ottoman power came in the year 1389, in the valley of the Kosovo River. There, face to face, stood Sultan Murad's army and a coalition of Christian forces led by the Serbian Prince Lazar. It was a total battle, the kind one feels before it even begins. For days, armies moved, spies were exchanged, strategies prepared. And when the time came, what unfolded was more than a clash between two sides. It was a collision of worldviews. The Battle of Kosovo has been told in many ways. Some sources speak of betrayal, others of heroism. But what history remembers is the image of a confrontation in which both leaders would die. Lazar captured and executed, Murad assassinated on the battlefield by an infiltrated Serbian nobleman. The Sultan's death was a symbolic blow, but it did not halt the advance. His son, Bayezid, immediately took command, executed the brother who might challenge him for the throne, and consolidated the victory. This moment marked a turning point. Europe realized the Ottomans were no passing threat, no regional actor. They were a military and political entity that had defeated a Christian coalition in the heart of the Balkans. From then on, fear spread through the Western courts. while local peoples learned to negotiate their survival under the new order. The conquest of the Balkans was not just territorial. It was also cultural, demographic, and economic. Land registry systems were established, trade routes were reorganized, languages and traditions were integrated into the imperial mosaic. And though Islam remained the central axis, the empire displayed a flexibility that was surprising. It did not demand mass conversion, but rewarded those who embraced its cause with power and prestige. Meanwhile, the web of power expanded underground. Tax registries, messengers, collectors, itinerant judges, architects raising mosques where monasteries had once stood. The Crescent did not arrive with wanton destruction. It came with order, with a system that offered continuity where previously there had been fragmentation. Many of the conquered peoples learned to live under the new regime. Some even prospered. Greek merchants grew wealthy under the Ottoman system. Bulgarian princes secured administrative positions. Even members of the Balkan nobility sent their sons to the Sultan's court, knowing they could find a better future there than among the ruins of their former alliances. The expansion continued northward, threatening Hungary, brushing past Transylvania, nearing the walls of cities that had never imagined the Crescent would rise over their horizon. Meanwhile, in Istanbul, still Constantinople, the Byzantine emperors watched helplessly as the Ottoman noose tightened decade by decade, their world shrinking to a handful of walled neighborhoods surrounded by a forming empire. The Balkans, now imperial territory, offered something fundamental: continental projection. From there, the Ottomans could look toward Vienna, toward Italy, toward the Adriatic. They were no longer an Asian power crossing the sea. They were now a fully European actor, firmly rooted, with their own cities and trade routes, with a professional army that dominated the region with little resistance. And thus, under the rule of Murad I, with the blood of Kosovo still fresh and the echoes of prayer resonating through the hills of Thrace, the Ottoman Empire established itself as the great power of southeastern Europe. What had begun as a frontier principality had become a complex machine, an idea impossible to ignore. A new world had set up camp at the gates of the old continent, and the centuries to come would be shaped by that presence. With the Balkans now under control, the empire would set its sights beyond victory, seeking a new kind of glory, an ambition deeper than politics and greater than land. Because from this point forward, expansion would no longer be just a strategy. It would become an obsession. The lightning that crossed the Danube. There was a name that traveled along the roads of the Danube like a veiled warning, a nickname turned prophecy, whispered by peasants, cautiously repeated by nobles, and feared by ambassadors. Yildirim, the lightning. That was the name given to Bayezid, son of Murad I, the young man who rose to the throne on the battlefield of Kosovo, still covered in his father's blood. He had no time for mourning, no ceremony, no treaties. His first act as Sultan was to execute his own brother to secure succession. There were no doubts, no empty promises. Bayezid ruled with the speed of a lightning bolt and the force of thunder. His temperament matched the time he lived in. Europe was disoriented, weakened, trying to reorganize after the humiliation of Kosovo. The Balkans, officially under Ottoman rule, boiled with internal tensions and scattered pockets of resistance. In Anatolia, several Turkoman beyliks had taken advantage of their new sultan's focus on Europe to reclaim autonomy. But Bayezid would not tolerate fragmentation or passivity. His style of governance was direct, accelerated, with no room for hesitation. Within a few years, his name alone could prompt troop movements before he even appeared on the horizon. It was in this early stage that Bayezid did something his predecessors had not dared to attempt: truly integrate the Anatolian mosaic under Ottoman authority. Western Asia Minor was full of former Turkish principalities, many of them led by dynasties that, like his own, traced their lineage back to the collapse of the Seljuk Empire. Some were allies out of convenience, others deeply resented Ottoman hegemony. But Bayezid had no intention of coexisting. His campaign was methodical and devastating. He incorporated beyliks by force or diplomatic submission, destroying fortresses, installing loyal governors, and relocating entire elites to more controlled regions. Anatolia, fragmented for decades, began to speak with one voice. Meanwhile, to the north, the Danube River marked the line between two worlds. On one side, Christian Europe, still retreating, still searching for a unifying narrative to contain Muslim expansion. On the other, an imperial machine that knew nothing of long truces. Bayezid crossed the Danube not as an explorer, but as a conqueror. He seized key fortresses in Bulgaria and Serbia, forced regional lords to sign vassalage treaties, and increased pressure on Hungary. The speed of his campaigns astonished even his own viziers. It was not that he made reckless decisions. He simply never seemed to doubt his destiny. The culmination of this tension came in one of the most dramatic moments of medieval European history, the Battle of Nicopolis. It was the year 1396, and for the first time in decades, Western Europe responded in a coordinated manner. Kings and nobles from France, Hungary, Germany, Burgundy, and other realms united in a crusade against the Ottomans. The threat was real. Letters from the Pope cried out for the defense of Christendom. Epic songs were already being composed before the battle even began. The Crusader army marched forward with an arrogance proportional to its detachment from reality. Dressed in heavy armor, convinced of their moral and military superiority, they expected a swift victory. What they found was Bayezid, waiting on the opposite bank of the Danube, with a perfectly organized army, motivated by faith, but sustained by impeccable strategy. The battle was a massacre. The Crusaders advanced without coordination, ignored the advice of their Balkan allies, and fell into a brutal ambush. When it ended, corpses covered the ground and rivers ran red. Accounts from the surviving European prisoners describe a calm, unflinching Bayezid, ordering executions while drinking wine. It was not gratuitous cruelty. It was a demonstration of power. After Nicopolis, fear settled over Europe like a thick fog. Christian courts stopped talking about offensives and began to think in terms of defense. The Pope's letters changed tone. Alliances became more cautious, and Constantinople, still in Byzantine hands, became an increasingly outdated relic that was difficult to protect. Bayezid understood the moment. He knew that the ancient capital of the Eastern Roman world was within reach. He besieged it patiently and relentlessly, surrounding it with fortresses, cutting off supply routes, and forcing it to pay tribute in order to survive. Yet his ambition did not stop there. In a gesture that seemed to foreshadow the future structure of the empire, Bayezid began to centralize the administrative apparatus. He summoned ulemas, organized the judicial system, strengthened the janissary corps, and introduced reforms aimed at giving coherence to an entity growing faster than it could absorb. But that same momentum pushed him to make a mistake that would change the fate of his reign. To the east, a shadow advanced. His name was Tamerlane, the Turco-Mongol conqueror who had ravaged Persia and the Caucasus and now turned his gaze toward Anatolia. Both leaders, of similar origin and with universal ambitions, could not coexist in the same historical space. The provocations piled up. Bayezid demanded respect for his authority over the beyliks that Tamerlane claimed as his own. Their letters were laced with venom and pride. Neither would yield. The confrontation was inevitable. In the year 1402, on the plains near Ankara, the two most formidable armies of the Islamic world faced each other. What followed was a complex and brutal battle, marked by internal betrayals. Some Turkoman troops defected to Tamerlane's side in the middle of the fight. Bayezid, surrounded, did not surrender. He fought until the end, was captured, and imprisoned in an iron cage. An image that would travel through European chronicles for centuries as a symbol of the fall of the invincible. His defeat was more than military. For the first time, the Ottoman Empire fractured from within. Bayezid's sons began to fight for power in a period that would become known as the Interregnum. Anatolia fell back into chaos. The Balkans were left without firm leadership, and European powers took the opportunity to catch their breath. But that fall, though deep, was not final. The structure Bayezid had forged, his victories, his reforms, his vision of the empire as a disciplined and swift machine, would continue to influence long after his death. And so ended the reign of the man who was lightning, a ruler who expanded the frontiers with near mythical momentum, who crushed crusades, reorganized the state, besieged the last Rome, and faced the most fearsome of conquerors. He fell, yes, but he left behind a legacy that did not vanish with him. Because what his defeat taught, paradoxically, was that the Ottoman project could stumble, but not disappear. In the depths of that crisis, among feuding brothers and shattered territories, an unexpected restoration began to take shape. A return that seemed impossible, but that would once again redraw the map. The war that had only brothers. There are moments when an empire does not fall because of its enemies, but because its own sons turn against each other with a ferocity that no foreign army could ever match. That is exactly what happened after the fall of Bayezid I. When Tamerlane defeated him on the arid lands of Ankara and locked him in an iron cage, the body of the Sultan was no longer free, but what truly collapsed was his legacy. An empire that, for the first time, was left without a head, without direction, without a heart to guide the rhythm of its arteries stretching across Anatolia and the Balkans. The capture of the Sultan was not only a military blow, it was a message. The conqueror of Samarkand had shown that Ottoman power, as relentless as it seemed, was vulnerable. And while Tamerlane's troops withdrew after plundering the lands that had once belonged to the Ottomans, leaving behind ruins, corpses, and broken alliances, something even more devastating began to take shape: civil war. Bayezid had several sons, and although it was tradition among the Ottoman sultans for the strongest heir to impose his authority by force, a brutal but functional system, the defeat at Ankara changed everything. The balance of power was broken, the structures were weakened, and the sons of the Thunderbolt saw, amid the chaos, an opportunity to claim the throne. Thus began a dark period that history would call the Interregnum, but that in essence was much more than a power vacuum. It was a war without glory, without heroes, without clear external enemies. A war that had only brothers. The names of the contenders were Musa, Isa, Mehmed, and Süleiman. Each had his own character, his own ambitions, his own alliances. None was strong enough to prevail quickly, and none was willing to yield. The result was a prolonged struggle that tore the body of the empire from within. Anatolia was divided into zones of influence. The Balkans were left without centralized control, and former allies began to negotiate with princes instead of with a single sultan. Authority shattered like a smashed mirror, and each shard reflected a different version of Ottoman power. Süleiman, the eldest, controlled Edirne and much of Europe. He tried to maintain a sense of imperial continuity from the former Balkan capital and had the support of some Christian lords. For his part, Isa settled in Bursa, trying to consolidate western Anatolia. Musa and Mehmed were initially in weaker positions, but over time, everything was reshaped through betrayals, temporary alliances, and devastating battles. The borders were not stable lines. They were wounds that changed shape week after week. During those years, what stood out the most was not the ferocity of the fighting, which was real, nor the cunning of the contenders, which they demonstrated, but the gradual erosion of the very idea of empire. While the brothers fought among themselves, the janissaries lost cohesion, the tax system ceased to function, mosques were left half-built, and trade routes were raided by bandits. The landscape, once ordered with great effort by previous generations, faded into a fog of uncertainty. In many villages, people no longer knew under whose name they should swear allegiance, and taxes were doubled because two princes claimed the same authority. The competition between brothers was not just a military struggle. It was also a battle for legitimacy. Each one tried to invoke the name of Bayezid, to use the symbols of power, to control the records, to attract the ulama, to secure the backing of religious and social leaders. But the truth was that they were all weakened. And paradoxically, that balance of weakness prevented any one of them from quickly imposing himself. The war dragged on like a slow poison that extinguishes strength from within without being immediately noticed. Meanwhile, external enemies watched with a mixture of astonishment and opportunism. The Byzantines, who for decades had been surrounded by the Ottomans, took advantage of the situation to regain diplomatic ground. They signed treaties, fueled internal divisions, and sought to buy time while their former besiegers devoured each other. In the Balkans, local Christian lords rebelled, knowing that the Ottoman response would be delayed or non-existent. Some even made direct pacts with one of the princes to eliminate another, deepening the crisis without resolving it. In this context of general exhaustion, one of the brothers began to stand out: Mehmed. At first, his position was fragile, almost irrelevant. But from the city of Amasya, in central Anatolia, he knew how to read the moment wisely. Instead of launching immediately into full-scale war, he chose to slowly consolidate his surroundings. He built regional alliances, strengthened his economic base, modernized his small army, and waited. He was not the most aggressive, but he was the most patient. And in times of prolonged war, patience is a form of power. When his moment came, Mehmed struck with precision. He defeated Isa first, then Musa, and finally confronted Süleiman. Each victory brought him closer to reunification. He did not do it with grand gestures, but with strategy. He understood that the empire needed more than a victor. It needed a restorer. By defeating his brothers, he not only eliminated rivals, he presented himself as the only figure capable of restoring stability, of stopping the bleeding. In the year 1413, after more than a decade of internal conflict, Mehmed I managed to bring both Anatolia and the Balkans back under his authority. He had won the war that had only brothers, but the price had been high. Cities destroyed, systems weakened, prestige eroded. The empire survived, but it was wounded. And what surprised observers most was not that it still existed, but that despite everything, it still had enough strength to recover. Mehmed I was not a spectacular conqueror, nor a radical reformer. He was, above all, a stabilizer. He dedicated his years of rule to reorganizing the administration, restoring order in the provinces, renewing the tax network, and limiting the power of the factions that had grown during the chaos. His figure is often overshadowed among the great names of the Ottoman lineage, but without his intervention, without his silent control, without his pragmatism after the civil war, the empire would likely have dissolved like so many others that were destroyed from within. And so, quietly, without triumphant proclamations or memorable campaigns, Mehmed closed a wound that threatened to become gangrene. He restored broken bridges, cleared the devastated fields, and prepared the way for a generation that would once again look outward, not as a threat, but as a promise. Because after years of war between brothers, the empire needed more than healing. It needed to remember who it was and where it was going. The return of stability. After a civil war, the empires that survive usually do so bearing very visible scars. The cities that were burned down take years to recover their commercial rhythm. The deserted roads require patient reconstruction and trust, both the trust of subjects in their sovereign and of external allies in the state, is a structure that must be rebuilt slowly, stone by stone. But the most difficult thing to restore, when violence has come from within, and has pitted brothers against each other instead of foreign enemies, is the very idea of unity. That abstract, invisible concept that sustains the entire imperial architecture. Mehmed I understood this. He was not a visionary, nor a relentless conqueror, nor a passionate reformer. He was a restorer. After putting an end to the interregnum and proclaiming himself sole sultan of the Ottoman Empire, his mission was not expansion, but internal reconfiguration. He inherited a disordered territory, a weakened bureaucracy, a scattered military network, and populations that were unsure under whose authority they were being governed. In many ways, his reign began with an unspoken question weighing on each region. Is this empire still an empire, or merely an echo of what it once was? Mehmed I's first answer was to return to the center, not as a political gesture, but as a survival strategy. He understood that before advancing, the internal pillars had to be reassembled. He restarted the fiscal system, not with spectacular reforms, but with a meticulous restoration of records, the assessment of proportional taxes, and the appointment of tax collectors who reported directly to the Sultan. In an empire where legitimacy was also expressed through the capacity to collect and redistribute wealth, regaining control over the treasury was as important as controlling an army. The second major task was the reorganization of the military body. The Janissaries, once a symbol of discipline and strength, had suffered from the fragmentation of central power. Without firm authority, some had turned into autonomous bands, while others had been used as tools by rival factions during the war between brothers. Mehmed I did not dissolve the system, but he reorganized it. He imposed a new hierarchy, reinforced the codes of obedience, and reintroduced the sense of mission that had characterized the earliest Janissary corps. He knew that, eventually, the empire would once again look toward its borders, and when that happened, it would need a loyal structure, not merely an armed contingent. Balance was also sought in the religious realm. The chaos of recent years had led to increased tensions among the empire's various communities, not so much because of matters of faith, but due to territorial power struggles and mutual distrust. Mehmed understood that Islam remained the backbone of the Ottoman project, but he also knew that the Christian populations, especially in the Balkans, represented a considerable part of the social and economic fabric of the state. Thus, he reaffirmed the protected status of the dhimmi, maintained differentiated taxes, but safeguarded religious practices and community structures. This combination of firm authority with functional tolerance allowed the empire to breathe with two different lungs without collapsing. One of his most emblematic decisions was the reactivation of cultural patronage. Although artistic and literary production was not the priority of his government, he understood that images mattered, that stories shaped identity. He sponsored the construction of mosques and madrasas, not only out of devotion, but to restore the symbolic centrality the empire needed. Cities that had lost importance during the conflict were revitalized with architecture, with centers of study, with spaces where Ottoman Islam could once again have a clear voice. And thus, slowly, a new network of meaning was being woven that went far beyond administrative matters. As he consolidated his control, Mehmed also began to rebuild external ties. Neighboring powers watched cautiously. After a decade of internal instability, few believed the empire had the strength to once again become a serious threat. But the Sultan acted wisely. He did not seek provocations. He sent ambassadors, restored interrupted treaties, secured trade routes, and brought predictability back to international relations. That predictability, so valued by Venetian merchants and Hungarian diplomats, was the key for the Ottoman Empire to regain its influence without resorting to force. At the same time, he understood that the dynasty needed to re-establish its aura. After the collapse brought on by the defeat against Tamerlane and the war among his sons, the image of Ottoman power had been eroded. That is why he carefully managed every symbol, every ceremonial act. He reinforced the idea of the Sultan as the shadow of God on earth, watchful but just, strong but patient. Friday sermons, delivered in his name, regained their political strength. Royal seals circulated more frequently. The court, though modest compared to later eras, once again became a center of gravity that set the empire's rhythm. One of the clearest gestures of his will for continuity was the controlled transfer of power to his son. Murad II, young but well-educated, was presented as the legitimate heir, prepared to assume leadership without dispute. It was not an abrupt or merely ceremonial handover, but a measured transition aimed at preventing the next generation from repeating the fratricidal drama of the recent past. And when Mehmed I died, in the year 1421, his son was already in position to take the throne with institutional support and full legitimacy. His death did not provoke a crisis. There were no immediate rebellions, no palace uprisings, no visible fractures. And that silence, that orderly transfer of power, was perhaps his greatest victory. Because after so much internal bloodshed, after a period when the Ottomans were on the verge of disintegration, that return to stability was not merely an act of governance, it was a promise fulfilled. The legacy of Mehmed I does not lie in grand conquests or monumental constructions. It lies in the spaces recovered, in the re-established balances, in the state machinery that once again functioned without creaking. What he left behind at his death was not an expansive empire, but a strong one, not triumphant, but solid. And that fertile ground, carefully prepared and without fanfare, would soon become the stage where a new, more ambitious energy would once again project itself outward. Because when the house is in order, empires begin to dream again. The architect of Ottoman expansion. When Mehmed I died, the Ottoman Empire had been quietly and carefully rebuilt. Its foundations were once again solid, but the structure was still modest compared to what it could eventually become. It needed someone who not only understood the value of order, but who could transform that base into a platform for ascent. That someone was his son, Murad II. At just 18 years old, Murad was no improvised youth. He had been trained from an early age under the watchful eyes of ulemas, viziers, and military commanders, in a court where the memory of civil war still lingered like a silent warning. He had observed how a fragile balance was maintained between different parts of the empire, and understood that to sustain what had been conquered, power alone was not enough. One had to project it, and that would become the hallmark of his reign. From his early years, Murad showed that he had no interest in half measures. In a short time, he faced internal challenges with a firmness that surprised those who believed his youth would be a sign of weakness. Some regions in Anatolia tried to reclaim their autonomy, thinking they could manipulate the new sultan. Murad responded with swift campaigns, public trials, and a clear signal to the rest. The throne was not vacant, and the empire would not tolerate dissent disguised as local tradition. But Anatolia was not his main concern. The true stage for his ambition was in Europe. The Balkans, already partially integrated into the Ottoman structure, now presented themselves as the perfect field for a second wave of expansion. And Murad had everything he needed to carry it out: a reorganized army, a stable administration, reactivated trade routes, and a reputation that was beginning to assert itself beyond the borders. The first confrontations were with Serbia and Wallachia, kingdoms that fluctuated between strategic submission and open rebellion. Murad knew how to play that game. Instead of launching full attacks right away, he combined diplomacy with calculated threats. He demanded tribute, oaths of loyalty, and in cases of refusal, he sent armies whose effectiveness left no room for doubt. This is how he achieved the Battle of Varna in the year 1444. A milestone that would mark the point of no return in the Ottomans' relationship with Europe. Varna was not just a military victory, it was an assertion. There fell Vladislav III of Poland, the young crusader king who had led the last great coordinated offensive by Christian crowns to halt the Muslim advance. Murad, who had even briefly abdicated the throne in favor of his son Mehmed, a complex move that he later reversed after realizing its failure, returned to personally lead the troops. And what he accomplished was more than a victory. It was a warning to all of the West that the Ottoman Empire was not retreating. It was awakening. After Varna, resistance in the Balkans began to crumble like ancient walls. Each region, each castle, each city that fell into Ottoman hands was administered with a rigor that left no room for chaos. Murad understood that war was the vehicle, but governance was the destination. That is why he reinforced the Timar system, a feudal model adapted to the Ottoman reality, in which soldiers received land in exchange for their service and were responsible for maintaining order and productivity in the areas under their control. It was a clever way to decentralize without losing authority. Each Ottoman knight, each spahi, became an extension of the state. Murad's figure was also closely linked to the development of bureaucracy. During his reign, tax records were improved. The role of the Divan, the imperial council, was consolidated, and the use of Turkish as the language of government was normalized, alongside Arabic and Persian for religious and literary matters. The empire began to speak with many voices, but only one direction. And that direction emanated from Edirne, which remained the official capital, though the horizon of something greater was already being projected. Spiritually, Murad maintained a careful balance between tradition and religious centrality. He presented himself as a defender of Islam, yes, but without falling into radicalism that might alienate his Christian subjects. Orthodox communities, especially in Bulgaria and Greece, continued their practices without direct interference, in exchange for the well-known dhimmi tax. That model of hierarchical tolerance allowed tensions to remain manageable, while reinforcing the Sultan's supremacy as the ultimate arbiter. A less visible, yet no less significant dimension was the way Murad consolidated the empire's cultural apparatus. He commissioned the construction of mosques, madrasas, and libraries. He encouraged the copying of manuscripts and the development of religious studies. Although his court was not yet the grand cultural center it would later become under his son, intellectual, academic, and artistic networks were already beginning to form. Networks that gave Ottoman power a symbolic language. Because an empire is not sustained by armies alone, it is sustained by narratives. Murad also understood something essential. A leader, no matter how strong, does not live forever. That is why, early on, he began preparing his son Mehmed for power. He provided him with religious, military, and diplomatic education. He exposed him to the complexities of the throne, accompanied him in delicate decisions, and taught him, perhaps without realizing it, to envision the empire as an expansive, unfinished work destined to grow. In that bond between father and son, the future promise was being woven, a promise that would change the course of history. When Murad died in the year 1451, he was not sent off with fireworks or celebrations. His legacy was silent but profound. He had not conquered Constantinople, had not founded new dynasties, had not written theological treatises nor reformed religions. But he left the stage fully prepared. He had unified the state, restored Ottoman prestige, professionalized warfare, stabilized the administration, and, most importantly, raised an heir with a clear idea of what had to come next. And what was coming was not small. Because on the horizon, beyond the Bosporus, beyond the hills that separated Europe from Asia, still stood the last remnant of Rome, Constantinople. A city that for centuries had defied invaders, resisted sieges, and cast its shadow as a symbol of eternity. But symbols, when they grow old, also begin to crack. And the Ottoman Empire, through a new gaze, was preparing to face the greatest challenge of its existence. The Fall of Constantinople. For more than 1,000 years, Constantinople had stood as a city seemingly immune to time, to crusades, to plagues, to the fractures of the ancient world. It had been the capital of empires, home to emperors, refuge for sacred relics and Byzantine intrigues whose echoes could still be heard in the empty corridors of the great palace. Its walls, double-layered, thick, reinforced with towers and legend, had withstood Arab sieges, Slavic assaults, and even attacks from Christian crusaders. And yet, by the dawn of the 15th century, it was no longer an impregnable city. It had become a living relic, grand, yes, but increasingly isolated, disconnected from the world around it, and surrounded by a young empire that did not see it as a monument, but as an inheritance still to be claimed. Mehmed II ascended to the throne at just 19 years old, but he carried with him a purpose sown since childhood. His education was not only religious or military, it was strategic. He had studied ancient maps, listened to the stories of Alexander, Caesar, and Justinian. He knew that empires worthy of remembrance needed a capital that was equally unforgettable. And Constantinople, wedged between two continents, breathing history from every column, was the ultimate prize. His father, Murad II, had considered taking it, but never launched the final blow. Mehmed, however, saw no alternative. His empire would not be complete while that city, though crumbling, still stood under the banner of the Byzantine eagle. On the throne of Constantinople sat Constantine XI, a brave emperor, yes, but abandoned. The Byzantine Empire was no longer truly an empire. It was a name barely surviving behind the walls of a single city. What had once been a power capable of projecting itself across the Mediterranean had been reduced to a capital surrounded by a sea of Ottoman territory. Constantine appealed to the West once again, calling for help from the Pope, from the kingdoms of Europe, from the Italian city-states. But the responses were timid, divided by old rifts between Catholics and Orthodox, or by the simple calculation that Constantinople was no longer worth the risk of open war with the Turks. Mehmed wasted no time. He began his preparations with a precision that blended engineering with prophecy. The first step was building the Rumeli Hisara fortress, just north of the Bosphorus, at its narrowest point. With it, he completely cut off maritime access to the Black Sea. It was a clear signal that this would not be just another siege. It would be the final encirclement. He then hired a Hungarian master founder named Urban, who designed the largest cannons the world had ever seen. The most famous of them, simply nicknamed the Basilisk, required dozens of oxen to transport and could launch projectiles weighing over 500 kilograms. The walls that had ensured Constantinople's survival for centuries were about to be tested as never before. The siege began on April 6, 1453. Constantinople prepared with the solemnity of a city that had lived through this before. The gates were reinforced, troops were stationed, watch rotations organized. The city was poorly equipped, with few men, scarce resources, and a population divided between those who still believed in a miracle and those who saw only a prelude to catastrophe. The defense was led by the Genoese Giovanni Giustiniani, who commanded the foreign soldiers with determination and courage. But neither his experience nor the emperor's valor could balance what was coming. For over 40 days, the city was pounded by cannon fire in a rhythmic persistence that shook the ground. The walls, initially resistant, began to give way. At night, the defenders tried to repair them with stones, wood, even corpses. By day, the Ottomans pressed forward by land and sea, tightening their grip on the city like a hand slowly choking a neck. The Golden Horn, protected by a massive chain, initially blocked the Ottoman fleet from entering the harbor. But Mehmed found a way to overcome that defense as well. He ordered his ships dragged overland, on rollers, from the Bosphorus to the inner harbor. When Constantinople's inhabitants saw enemy sails appear behind the chains, they understood that no corner was safe anymore. As the siege dragged on, internal tensions grew. Constant liturgies were held, processions with relics, endless masses. People spoke of visions, signs in the sky, saints who would intercede. But in the streets, hunger and exhaustion began to take their toll. Those who once prepared to resist now only wished for the end to come quickly, whatever it might be. In the early hours of May 29th, Mehmed gave the order. The assault began in darkness, led by the expendables, the irregulars, the Akunci, sent as cannon fodder to wear down the defenders. Then came the Janissaries, disciplined, trained, clad in white tunics with eyes fixed on the prize. The wall was finally breached near the gate of St. Romanus. Justiniani was wounded, breaking the defenders' morale. Constantine XI, the last Byzantine emperor, threw himself into the final battle, sword in hand, dressed in purple. His body was never identified. The city fell before noon. Ottoman troops entered through the breaches, and for hours, Constantinople endured the classical sack of every conquered city. Houses burned, temples profaned, screams in the streets. But once Mehmed knew the victory was absolute, he entered on horseback, headed directly to Hagia Sophia, converted into a mosque that same day, and ordered the restoration of order. The surviving inhabitants were registered, resettled, or freed by ransom. The city was not destroyed. It was absorbed, and so, Constantinople, the second Rome, ceased to exist. In its place, Istanbul was born. Mehmed II was not only the city's conqueror, he was its transformer. He reorganized its urban structure, repopulated its neighborhoods, converted churches into mosques, founded schools and libraries, and declared that this city was no longer the symbol of a fallen civilization, but the capital of a rising empire. The fall of Constantinople was not just the end of an era, it was the beginning of another. It marked the definitive close of medieval Europe and the rise of a new order in the Eastern Mediterranean. An empire that did not just dominate territories, but knew how to take the ruins of the past and turn them into foundations for the future. And while the domes of Istanbul began to shape a new horizon, Mehmed's ambitions remained unsatisfied. What he had just conquered was only a stage. Because now that he had the city, the next step was to make it the jewel of a world larger than any map had ever imagined. The city that changed the world. Istanbul was not born the moment Mehmed crossed the gates of Constantinople among fallen columns and the echoes of silenced bells. It did not arise from a military gesture, the thunder of cannons, or the brief looting that followed the conquest. Istanbul began to take shape when the young Sultan, still wrapped in the adrenaline of triumph, dismounted his horse in front of Hagia Sophia, gazed upon the Byzantine mosaics stained with dust, and decided that this city, broken but intact, would not be a looted jewel, but the beating heart of a new world. Where others might have seen only spoils or vengeance, he saw permanence. That was his difference. Mehmed did not merely want to add Constantinople to the list of Ottoman conquests. He wanted to absorb it and refound it, to rewrite it without erasing it. He had the instincts of a conqueror, but the vision of a builder. And that is what gave birth to Istanbul, a metropolis projected toward the future, built upon the ancient foundations of Eastern Rome, designed to reflect the power, culture, faith, and sophistication of an empire that was no longer emerging, but fully established. The first great challenge was to repopulate it. After decades of decline and a devastating siege, the city was nearly empty. Houses were abandoned, plazas were silent, neighborhoods were destroyed or deserted. To revive it, Mehmed ordered an ambitious program of population relocation. From Anatolia, the Balkans, and other parts of the empire came Turks, Greeks, Armenians, and Sephardic Jews. These last ones later expelled from the Iberian Peninsula and welcomed by the Ottomans. It was not a homogeneous occupation, but a planned mix. The Sultan wanted Istanbul to be an imperial city in every sense, diverse, functional, centralized, and spiritually vibrant. Religious conversion was immediate, but not total. Hagia Sophia was transformed into a mosque, sending a clear signal about the new identity of the capital. However, many churches remained open, many monasteries remained standing, and the Christian communities, although removed from central power, preserved their internal hierarchies. Mehmed needed the city to function, and he understood that to achieve that, he had to avoid social fracture. His approach was pragmatic. Ottoman Islam was firm, yes, but it knew how to coexist with what did not threaten its structure. At the same time, an unprecedented policy of construction and restoration began. The walls were repaired, aqueducts returned to function, new streets were laid out, and neighborhoods were created, organized by community. Mosques, madrasas, bazaars, caravanserais, and public baths were built at a pace that seemed unthinkable. The city filled with domes, minarets, and courtyards echoing the murmur of water. Ottoman architecture, at that moment still influenced by Persian and Byzantine models, began to acquire its definitive personality. Elegant, expansive, and deeply symbolic. The administrative center was moved to a place that would become the brain of the empire, the Topkapi Palace. Built upon the old Byzantine Acropolis, at the precise point where the Sea of Marmara, the Bosporus, and the Golden Horn meet, the Topkapi was not a European-style palace like Versailles, nor a medieval castle. It was a labyrinthine complex, made up of courtyards, pavilions, council halls, and gardens that reflected the logic of Ottoman power. The center was always hidden. Access was gradual, and the throne was located at the end of a path designed to inspire reverence. From there, the Sultan ruled not only through decrees, but through presence. The palace was a theater of authority, where every gesture carried weight, every silence could be interpreted, and every foreign visitor was received with a precisely staged performance. On the walls of the Divan, the Imperial Council, decisions were recorded that affected provinces thousands of kilometers away, and in the archives, maps, treaties, censuses, and secrets accumulated. For the first time in centuries, Istanbul was no longer a frontier of resistance. It was the nucleus of the Ottoman world. The city also became a commercial hub. Its location, at the exact crossroads between Europe and Asia, between the Slavic North and the Arab South, between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, transformed it into an inevitable meeting point. Caravans loaded with silk arrived, ships full of grain, Italian merchants negotiating with Persians, Hungarian diplomats, and Arab scholars. Mehmed knew that an empire does not survive by war alone. Therefore, he promoted trade, protected routes, standardized weights and measures, and granted concessions to those who could energize the urban economy. And of course, knowledge also flourished in Istanbul. The Sultan sponsored translations, founded libraries, gathered astronomers, poets, jurists, and physicians. Greek manuscripts were brought in, Persian treatises were copied, and works of classical Islam were adapted. The city became an intellectual hub, not yet as exuberant as it would later become, but clearly on its way. It was a city of faith, but also of calculation. A city of prayer, but also of reason. What was happening in Istanbul held deep symbolic value. The Christian world, especially in Eastern Europe, began to understand that the fall of Constantinople had not been an isolated catastrophe. It had marked an irreversible change. The city was no longer a besieged bastion, but a resplendent capital of an empire that considered itself the legitimate heir of Rome, though with a different language, a different religion, and a different vision of destiny. And that, ultimately, was what disturbed many, because it was not a barbarian empire that had settled there, but a structured, disciplined, and ambitious civilization. Over time, Istanbul would acquire an almost mystical aura. People said that whoever ruled that city ruled 3 continents. And it was not an exaggeration. From its walls, armies were projected, viziers were dispatched, commerce was directed, and history was written. The city, with its silhouette full of domes, the distant roar of markets, and the slow call of the muezzin was a declaration in stone of Ottoman power. And yet, despite its political and religious weight, Istanbul never ceased to be a space of mixture. Walking through its streets, one could hear Turkish, Greek, Armenian, Ladino, and Arabic. One could see synagogues, churches, dervishes whirling at sunset, and Italian merchants haggling in the bazaars. That harmonious chaos, that tense but stable coexistence, was what made Istanbul not just a capital, but a mirror of the empire itself. When Mehmed died, still young, Istanbul was already firmly established as the heart of the Ottoman world. His most visible legacy was not a palace, nor a law, nor a military campaign. It was a city rebuilt, reimagined, and set to beat with a new soul without denying its past. There, at that crossroads of seas and centuries, Islam, politics, architecture, and history joined hands to form a center that would radiate influence for generations. And from that reconfigured city, the empire would once again begin to look outward, with new goals, new campaigns, and new conquerors. Because once the capital is in place, everything else becomes possible. The Age of the Conquerors. When a city is conquered, history often lingers on the moment of victory. The gate being breached, the banner rising, the soldiers pouring through dusty streets like human gusts. But for Mehmed II, Constantinople was only the threshold, a door that opened onto a much longer and more ambitious corridor. Because his empire, though it now had a center, still lacked defined contours. And in the mental map of the young sultan, every nearby region seemed like a natural extension of his project. Where others might have built walls to preserve what had been gained, he saw borders to be pushed outward. And that mindset, precise, relentless, insatiable, was what set the tone for the rest of his reign. A period we now recognize as the true consolidation of the Ottoman Empire as a regional and civilizational superpower. After taking the capital, Mehmed was not content with his newfound prestige. He used it as a driving force. Istanbul had to radiate power in all directions, and for that to happen, he had to ensure that no corner of Anatolia remained outside of his control. At the time, there were still semi-independent Turkoman beyliks, some of them former allies or ambiguous vassals who used their cultural proximity to maintain a degree of autonomy. Mehmed put an end to that ambiguity without sentiment. Through swift and effective campaigns, he subdued or annexed principalities like Karaman, Kandar, and other enclaves that had survived for decades through temporary pacts and tribal rivalries. But Anatolia, though strategic and symbolically important, was only one part of the equation. Mehmed's attention soon shifted to the north, east, and west, with the precision of someone who does not improvise, but executes a carefully drawn program. One of his first targets was the Black Sea region, where the empire of Trebizond still survived, a Byzantine remnant nestled among mountains, castles, and rugged coastlines. Though its existence seemed more decorative than real, Mehmed understood that as long as such enclaves persisted, the narrative of his rule would remain incomplete. In the year 1461, after a calculated siege, Trebizond fell. With it, the final branch of Byzantium was severed, and the northern coast came fully under Ottoman control. At the same time, the expansion in the Balkans gained an unstoppable rhythm. Serbia was integrated as a province, Bosnia was conquered, and its nobility absorbed through a combination of violence and promises, and Albania, under the fierce resistance of Skanderbeg, became one of the few areas where the Ottomans faced prolonged and effective opposition. Skanderbeg, a charismatic leader and ruthless tactician, resisted for decades with support from the papacy and some Italian kingdoms. Even so, after his death, the Ottoman forces eventually prevailed there as well, closing one of the most intense chapters of Balkan resistance. To the west, the Sultan turned his gaze toward the Latin world. In a bold move, he landed troops in southern Italy, in the region of Otranto. It was a brief incursion, but full of meaning. For the first time, the Ottomans touched the heart of the Italian peninsula, and although they were unable to hold the territory, partly due to Mehmed's sudden death, the gesture alone was enough to spread panic in Rome and prompt a defensive reorganization across the Mediterranean. From that moment on, the Christian world could no longer view the Ottoman Empire as a distant neighbor or just another Eastern power. It was a direct, concrete, sophisticated threat. As vast as the military campaigns were, they would not have been possible without a robust internal structure. Mehmed dedicated a substantial part of his reign to strengthening that structure. He perfected the devshirme system, increasing the frequency of levies of Christian boys who would be trained as janissaries or state administrators. The janissaries, ever more numerous, became an elite force that acted as the Sultan's direct armed arm, detached from traditional noble lineages and entirely dependent on the palace. This structural loyalty was key to sustaining the campaigns without internal fractures. In parallel, the civil administration was reorganized with a rationality that left little room for improvisation. Lands were surveyed, taxes standardized, legal codes reformed, and specialized bodies created to oversee the provinces. The empire began to function like a self-regulating organism, where the center did not merely issue orders, but constantly absorbed information from every corner to adjust its operation. This efficiency allowed it to maintain internal control while sustaining military campaigns, something many empires failed to do once they expanded too quickly. Diplomacy also played a central role in his strategy. Mehmed did not underestimate his enemies. He studied them. He maintained permanent ambassadors, cultivated spies, forged temporary alliances with Italian cities when it suited him, and skillfully exploited European divisions to prevent a unified response to his expansion. His relationship with Venice was complex. Open warfare at times, commercial agreements at others. But in all cases, Mehmed played the entire board, fully aware that an empire is not imposed by force alone, but by the ability to anticipate the opponent's moves. His personal image also evolved over the years. He was no longer the young man who had entered Constantinople with eyes gleaming with promise. He was now a full-fledged emperor, dressed austerely, fluent in several languages, debating with scholars and personally supervising translations of Greek and Persian texts. He ordered the compilation of classical treatises, promoted astronomy and medicine, and even delved into the study of geography with uncommon intensity for a ruler of his time. For him, culture was not an ornament, but a tool of power. Istanbul had to shine also for its wisdom. Despite his achievements, the end of his life was not triumphant. Mehmed died suddenly in 1481, while preparing a new campaign, the target of which remains debated among historians to this day. Some believe he planned to attack Rhodes. Others point to a decisive offensive on Italy. What is certain is that his death abruptly interrupted a trajectory that had seemed boundless. But the legacy he left behind was more solid than any isolated conquest. His empire was now a solid entity, with an effective administrative center, a wide-reaching territorial control network, a feared military structure, and a capital city that embodied the symbolic power of all previous centuries. And from that inherited legacy, others would carry on the project. Because the empire that had begun as a frontier principality after Mehmed II's death no longer needed to prove its existence. What would follow was no longer compulsive expansion, but the consolidation of internal power, the sophistication of the palace, and the transformation of government into something even deeper, more centralized, something that appeared to many immortal. The court of the eternal sultans. When an empire stabilizes after a fierce expansion, its palaces begin to pulse with a different kind of energy. War ceases to be constant, and power, instead of advancing outward, retreats inward, sharpens, and settles. In the case of the Ottoman Empire, that transformation had both a physical and mental setting. the Topkapi Palace, a place that was not merely a residence, nor a defensive bastion, nor an administrative center, but a universe contained within courtyards, walls, gardens, pavilions, and corridors that organized the world around the body and will of the Sultan. From the outside, Topkapi might seem austere. Far from the marble and gold excesses that characterized other centers of power, it spread organically across the highest hill of Istanbul, overlooking the Bosphorus, as if each new wing had been built according to the needs of the moment, rather than out of a symmetrical obsession. But inside, everything followed an almost liturgical hierarchy. The first courtyard was public, the last nearly secret, and between one and the other unfolded the mechanics of a state that had learned to govern itself through silence, ritual, and constant surveillance. At the center of that mechanism stood the Sultan, a sacred figure, a symbol of justice, defender of the faith, and at the same time, a man surrounded by political solitude. Access to his presence was neither easy nor frequent. The viziers communicated with him through written reports, presented on golden trays. Direct audiences were rare and choreographed down to the smallest detail, because distance was also a form of authority. Power that is not often seen becomes myth, and myth is harder to challenge. Entire institutions revolved around the Sultan. The most powerful of all was the Divan, the imperial council, made up of viziers who met daily under the supervision of the Grand Vizier, a figure who often acted in roles similar to those of a prime minister. In practice, the Sultan did not always intervene in every decision, but everything happened in his name, and any document leaving the Divan did so with his seal and under his shadow. This system allowed for a remarkable degree of efficiency. While the ruler could retreat to study, poetry, or military strategy, the state continued to function with precision. One of the most enigmatic aspects of the Ottoman court was the structure of the harem. Far from the Orientalist image built by European art, full of idle women reclining on silk cushions, the harem was a center of female power, regulated with strict discipline. It was composed of hundreds of women, many of them slaves or concubines, others brought from the farthest borders of the empire. Some never saw the Sultan. Others managed to rise, earn his trust, bear his children, and in some cases, become political figures of weight. The most influential of all was the Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning Sultan. Her position granted her informal but real power. She oversaw marital alliances, influenced palace appointments, and in times of instability, could act as a key advisor. On several occasions, especially during the 16th century, these women ruled in practice through their underage or inexperienced sons. This period, known by historians as the Sultanate of Women, was not a frivolous anomaly, but an adaptation of the system to the invisible power that flowed behind the walls. Beside them, another essential figure completed the interior structure: the eunuchs. Originating from Africa and Asia, castrated and trained from childhood, the eunuchs fulfilled roles of surveillance, administration, and security within the harem and the palace itself. The Black Eunuch, or Kızlar Asa, was one of the most powerful officials in the empire, with direct access to the Sultan and the ability to control the flow of information within the heart of Topkapi. The logic of control passed through his hands. No paper, no person, no rumor circulated without his knowledge. Beyond the harem and the divan, the court was articulated through a network of daily rituals that kept the imperial machinery in motion. The kitchen, for example, was a universe unto itself. Hundreds of cooks, bakers, butchers, water carriers, and spice handlers worked each day in perfect shifts to feed thousands of people. The Sultan's food was overseen by a specific officer, responsible for tasting each dish before it reached his table, not only out of protocol but also for security. In the Ottoman ceremonial, even the act of drinking water became an expression of power. The palace libraries housed ancient manuscripts, copies of Islamic classics, and treatises on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and poetry. The Sultan, even when not actively ruling, was expected to be educated in all the sciences of his time. He was not expected to possess only strength or cunning, but also knowledge. This vision of the ruler as a complete, enlightened, and spiritual figure reflected a deeply Ottoman idea of power. The Sultan was not a man among men. He was a synthesis of moral, political, and cultural authority. The court was also a stage of internal espionage. Every sector had informants reporting to the palace. The viziers were watched by their secretaries, the secretaries by their scribes, and those scribes by special officers in the service of the Sultan. Silence was common currency, and rumor, a means of survival. Punishments for treason or insubordination were swift and exemplary. Executions were carried out in secret, and the body of the condemned vanished without a trace. Because imperial stability could not be questioned by scandal, order had to be preserved even in death. In this microcosm, where every gesture carried political meaning, foreign ambassadors visiting the court were impressed, and often disoriented, by the combination of ritual, austerity, and precision. Ottoman protocol was a performance designed to communicate hierarchy without the need for words. The audience with the Sultan, if granted, was the culmination of a choreography that could last days, whose objective was not merely to impress, but to place the visitor in a clear position, under the gaze of the throne. Over time, this court became an autonomous universe, capable of generating its own logic of power, its own alliances, its own internal conflicts. As the sultans progressively withdrew from active politics, occupied by palace life, or simply absorbed by the isolation of power, the bureaucratic and ceremonial machinery that surrounded them gained more weight. It was not a decline, at least not in its early phases, but a mutation. Power continued to flow, but it did so through different channels. Topkapi, then, was not merely a place. It was an idea. A model of control where the state was articulated through mystery, protocol, and precise administration. A center of gravity that held together a vast empire with hundreds of ethnicities, religions, and languages. There, among limestone walls and wooden ceilings, decisions were made that affected caravans in the desert, villages in the Alps, and entire cities in the Balkans. And while the outside world began to change, as new routes opened across the ocean, and Europeans discovered continents not found on maps, the heart of the empire kept beating with its own rhythm. But the doors to the future, though still distant, had already begun to open. And when they did, the eternal structures of the palace would have to face something for which they were not entirely prepared. Selim the Cruel and the Empire of the Crescent Moon. There are names that are spoken with respect, others with fear, and a few with a dangerous mixture of both. Among the Ottoman sultans, the name of Selim I is heard like a blade that cuts through memory. For the Turks, he was Yavuz, the Resolute, although in other languages he became known as the Cruel. His reign was brief, but the impact he left on Ottoman history was so profound that it feels as though it lasted for generations. Because under his rule, the empire changed in form, in scale, and even in soul. It did not only grow in territory, it absorbed the idea of Islam as an absolute imperial standard. And with that, it rose as the power that from that moment on would guard the most sacred places of the Muslim faith. The Empire of the Crescent Moon was not just a nickname. It was a geopolitical fact sealed by his fist. Selim did not have the usual profile of the heirs raised in Topkapi. He was serious, austere, devoted to study, but also ruthlessly practical. While he was still a prince, he did not hesitate to eliminate his own brothers to secure his succession. He forced his own father, Bayezid II, to abdicate through political pressure and veiled threats. The transition was neither peaceful nor ceremonial. It was a direct seizure of power. And from that first move, he made it clear that his vision of the throne did not include internal rivalry, sentimentality, or passivity. From the moment he tied the turban of the Sultan, Selim turned his gaze to the east. Unlike his predecessors, who had concentrated on the Balkans, the Black Sea, and the Christian European world, he understood that the true core of Islam lay beyond the deserts of Syria and Mesopotamia. His ambition was not simply to rule a powerful empire. It was to place himself at the spiritual center of the Muslim world. And to do so, he had to defeat those who already claimed that center. His most immediate target was the Safavid Empire of Persia, ruled by Ismail I, a young, charismatic, and fanatically Shiite leader. The conflict was not only territorial, but also ideological. Selim, as a defender of Sunni Islam, saw the Shiite advance as an existential threat, not only to the religious orthodoxy he upheld, but to the unity of the empire. The eastern frontiers could not be gray areas. So he organized one of the most decisive campaigns of his time, crossing Anatolia with a large, well-equipped army, above all, imbued with a cause that went beyond personal ambition, defending the true faith against heresy. The Battle of Chaldiran, in the year 1514, was the breaking point. The Safavids, though they fought with zeal, were not prepared for the Ottoman artillery and discipline. Ismail's army was crushed, his capital was sacked, and the Shiite threat was contained, at least for a time. Selim did not continue on to the heart of Persia. His intention was not to occupy every corner, but to secure strategic balance. What he wanted lay further south. And so began his second great campaign, the conquest of Egypt and Syria, then under the control of the Mamluks. This time, the war was not only political or theological, but also symbolic. The Mamluks, based in Cairo, had for centuries held custody of the holy sites of Islam, Mecca and Medina. Though their actual influence was already in decline, they still held immense prestige. Selim understood that to crown his authority, weapons were not enough, not even law. He needed to touch the soul of the Muslim world. He needed the title of caliph. The campaign was swift and brutal. At Marj Dabik, near Aleppo, the Ottoman forces crushed the Mamluk army. The Mamluk Sultan himself fell in battle. Then, in the Battle of Ridania, near Cairo, Selim sealed his dominion over Egypt. He entered the city with a sense of strategic moderation. He allowed some local structures to remain, kept certain religious leaders in their positions, but made it clear that the axis of power had changed hands. The Prophet's relics were carefully transferred to Istanbul, and with them, the symbols of the caliphate. From that moment on, Selim was not only a sultan, he was the commander of the believers, the protector of the two sanctuaries. And although the title of caliph was not immediately proclaimed in a permanent and public manner, it began to circulate in documents and rituals in subtle yet forceful ways. Pilgrims traveling to Mecca now passed through Ottoman territory, and on their coins, in their mosques, in their laws, the imprint of the new power was unmistakable. The crescent moon stretched from the Balkans to the Nile, from the Persian Gulf to the Adriatic Sea, and at the center, the stern face of a man who did not seem to have sought glory, but had ended up gathering it all. Selim was, in many ways, a paradox. He ruled with an iron hand, eliminating dissent with methodical coldness, but at the same time showed deep respect for scholars, judges, and intellectuals. He surrounded himself with Islamic thinkers, reviewed theological texts, funded religious works, and ordered the purging of religious currents he considered deviant, all under the belief that the empire could not tolerate doctrinal ambiguity. In his mind, ideological chaos was the prelude to political dissolution. He was never a man of the palace. He distrusted intrigue, avoided long ceremonies, stayed close to the army, and preferred sober reports over flattery. It was said he could go days without speaking if he deemed it unnecessary, and that every word he spoke carried the weight of an order. He did not rule with theatricality, but with an economy of gestures, and that made him all the more feared. His reign lasted only 8 years, but when he died in the year 1520, he had left the empire larger, more unified, and more influential than ever before. His son, Süleiman, would inherit not only a strengthened state, but also a power structure capable of sustaining a golden age. Because what Selim had done, without concessions, without hesitation, was to prepare the ground for a greatness that had not yet arrived, but was already in the air. And though many called him cruel, and his methods continue to spark debate, no one can deny that under his rule, the Ottoman Empire was transformed into something new. Not just a regional power, but the spiritual, political, and military center of Islam. And so, after the thunder of his campaigns, what remained was an architecture of power so firm that even the passage of centuries could not entirely erase it. Because some men build with ideas, and others with iron. Selim belonged to the latter group, and the iron he left behind still echoed in the gates of the empire when his successor took the throne. Süleiman and the Ottoman Golden Age. When Selim I closed his eyes for the last time, he left behind a colossal empire, a rigidly tuned state apparatus, and a map that stretched from the deserts of Egypt to the shores of the Danube. But the pinnacle of Ottoman magnificence was not built through the force of his sword. It was achieved through the precise balance of law, art, war, and diplomacy mastered by his son, Süleiman. The Sultan whom the Western world would remember as the Magnificent, and whom the Islamic world would forever know as the Lawgiver, did not merely inherit a powerful empire. He knew how to shape it, perfect it, and elevate it into a form of civilization that would leave a mark even on its enemies. Süleiman ascended the throne in the year 1520 at just 26 years of age. His education had been extensive, rigorous, and deeply rooted in palace traditions. He spoke several languages, read poetry, debated theology, and understood the administrative machinery of the empire with precision. Yet he quickly demonstrated that his cultural sensitivity did not distance him from the actual exercise of power. His first political move was strategic. He consolidated his position, eliminated potential threats, and with implacable calm, made it clear that beneath his refined exterior pulsed a heart of iron. Military campaigns marked the early years of his reign. In the year 1521, he personally led the offensive against the Kingdom of Hungary, and in the famous Battle of Mohacs, the Ottoman army devastated the Hungarian forces with deadly precision. The young king Louis II drowned while fleeing, and the Hungarian throne was left exposed to a succession crisis that the Ottomans skillfully exploited. Süleiman not only seized Buda, but managed to turn much of the kingdom into vassal territory, maintaining a balance between direct occupation and indirect control. Then, in the year 1529, his armies marched toward Vienna. The city, a symbol of the European heartland, was besieged, and although it did not fall, the message was clear. The Ottomans were no longer a distant threat. They were a force capable of striking at the very gates of the Holy Roman Empire. Though the siege failed due to logistical and weather-related reasons, the psychological impact on Europe was profound. From that moment on, Süleiman would be viewed with a mix of terror, admiration, and fascination. But his campaigns were not limited to Europe. The East also demanded his attention. The rivalry with the Safavids had not cooled following his father's death. In successive expeditions, Süleiman managed to capture Baghdad and solidify Ottoman control over Iraq and parts of western Persia, securing the routes to Mecca and Medina and reinforcing his role as guardian of the sacred places of Islam. Meanwhile, at sea, the alliance with the legendary corsair Hayreddin Barbarossa enabled the empire to seriously challenge Christian powers, especially Venice and Spain, for control of the Mediterranean. However, Süleiman's true greatness was not measured only in conquered lands. It was his ability to shape power through law that cemented his legacy. Under his reign, a vast number of regulations were codified, governing everything from land ownership to the conduct of officials, including commerce, criminal law, and religious protocols. These laws were not radical innovations, but rather syntheses and refinements of centuries of Ottoman practice. But under his signature, they gained official, almost sacred, status. The empire, which had until then functioned as a superstructure of customs and temporary decrees, was transformed into a coherent and enduring legal body. The impact of this legal framework was felt across every level of society. In the most remote provinces, judges and administrators knew what was expected. In the markets, merchants could trust in an authority that protected contracts and punished abuse. In the countryside, peasants understood their fiscal duties and the limits of local power. This structure provided stability, and that stability allowed the flourishing of the arts, architecture, and intellectual thought. Süleiman's Istanbul was a city of controlled splendor. There, the Sultan promoted an architecture that sought to uplift the spirit without overwhelming the individual. To achieve this, he relied on the genius of Mimar Sinan, a former janissary who would become the imperial architect. Under his direction, mosques, bridges, aqueducts, mausoleums, and educational complexes were erected, transforming the urban landscape into a symphony of stone and domes. The Süleiman Mosque, built atop a hill overlooking the Golden Horn, remains to this day one of the purest expressions of the Ottoman ideal of harmony among faith, power, and beauty. But Süleiman's inner world was also a stage for tensions, tragedies, and bitter decisions. The harem became a silent battlefield, where the figure of Hürrem, also known as Roxelana, marked an unexpected turn. This woman, a slave of Slavic origin, rose not only as the Sultan's favorite concubine but also as his legal wife, breaking centuries of tradition. Through her influence, the balance of power within the palace shifted. Great viziers fell, princes were executed, and the politics of succession became increasingly turbulent. The relationship between Süleiman and his Grand Vizier, Ibrahim Pasha, began as a deep, almost brotherly friendship. Ibrahim served as his confidant, his emissary, and his right hand for years. However, his growing power, his arrogance, and his gestures that bordered on establishing a parallel monarchy sealed his fate. Süleiman, in an act as cold as it was necessary, ordered his execution. It marked an emotional and political turning point. From that moment, the Sultan became more reserved, more melancholic, more immersed in his thoughts and poetry. Yes, Süleiman wrote poetry. Under the pen name Muhibbi, he left behind hundreds of poems still studied today for their beauty and depth. In them, he spoke of love, fate, and the fleeting nature of power. For although he ruled one of the largest empires in history, he understood that everything is temporary, that marble cracks, that victories are forgotten, and that only art and law can defy time. When he died in the year 1566, during a campaign in Hungary, his body was buried far from the battlefield. But his true mausoleum had already been built in Istanbul, next to the mosque that bears his name. There, under a perfect dome, his remains rest, surrounded by inscriptions that speak of justice, power, and eternity. And although the later history of the empire would take unpredictable turns, during Süleiman's reign, the Ottoman Empire reached a balance so rare, so complex, and so luminous that centuries later it is still remembered as the Golden Age. But no splendor lasts forever. That perfect balance began to crumble from within, with dangerous silences, decisions delayed too long, and princes who learned to fear before they learned to rule, because the price of so much greatness would soon be the fear of their own lineage. The empire that feared its own sons. After the splendor of Süleiman, the Ottoman Empire awoke into a tense calm, as if beneath the surface of its power everything was held together by a fragile layer. The borders remained firm, the administrative machinery functioned, and the world viewed Istanbul as a superpower that had reached its peak. But within the inner chambers of the Topkapi Palace, in the tapestry-covered halls of the harem, a much more delicate conflict was beginning to take shape. The fear of their own lineage. Because if there was one thing the Ottoman system of government made clear after Süleiman, it was that the greatest threat to the throne was not foreign nations, nor rebellious provinces, but the Sultan's own sons. Succession was not governed by a clear principle of primogeniture. There was no automatic inheritance, nor was any prince officially designated as heir. All of the Sultan's sons were, in theory, valid candidates. And that ambiguity, which for centuries had allowed flexibility and competition, began to turn into a minefield where the only way to survive was to eliminate the others. Fratricide, killing one's own brothers to secure the throne, was not a hidden or isolated practice. It was legalized and formalized by imperial decree. Bayezid II had tolerated it. Selim I had exercised it without hesitation. But it was under Mehmed III that the horror reached an unimaginable scale. Upon ascending to power, he ordered the strangulation of 19 of his brothers, all children or adolescents, some still in early childhood. Their bodies were buried in silence, without ceremony, as if they were palace heirs rather than imperial princes. The most disturbing part was not the act itself, but its acceptance. In Ottoman logic, the murder of brothers was considered a lesser evil, a way to prevent civil wars and ensure the continuity of the state. It was a political decision, wrapped in a moral justification. Better to sacrifice a few than risk the ruin of the entire empire. But that logic, no matter how pragmatic, began to generate a paranoid atmosphere that would affect all levels of power. To protect future sultans from premature ambition, they were kept confined, literally. The kafé system, the cage, involved secluding the crown princes in a section of the palace where they lived under watch, without contact with the outside world, without political education, and often without even knowing whether they would ever come out alive. Some spent decades in that palace semi-darkness, surrounded by rumors, silence, and fear. When they finally reached the throne, they were not prepared men, but shadows deformed by confinement. The figure of the Sultan, once the active center of military and legislative power, began to fade. He was no longer the leader who rode with his army to the frontiers, who issued laws in public audience or debated with scholars and jurists. He became, more and more, an absent being, detached from the world, surrounded by eunuchs, women of the harem, and bureaucrats who governed in his name. And into that void, power began to shift into other hands. The Grand Viziers, those ministers with nearly absolute authority, gained ground. They managed the campaigns, negotiated with ambassadors, ruled the provinces, and at times made decisions that the Sultan signed without fully understanding them. Some viziers amassed so much power that their assassination or political downfall caused greater crises than the death of the monarch himself. The balance was fragile, because no one truly knew where real authority began or ended. Meanwhile, the harem ceased to be merely a domestic space and became a first-order political institution. The mothers of the princes, known as Valide Sultans, became central figures of the state. Some ruled from the shadows for years, influencing appointments, alliances, and decisions of war. They were the ones who wove a web of silent power, where intrigue, favors, and loyalties were decided not on the battlefield, nor in the imperial council, but in the quiet hallways at the heart of the palace. All of this took place while outwardly, the empire continued to function. The provinces sent tribute. The troops maintained peace. European ambassadors still addressed the Sultan as the most powerful sovereign of the East. But inside the structure, something was cracking. The strength that had once emerged from the balance between military power, legal cohesion, and religious legitimacy was beginning to fade. The court became ceremonial. Positions were sold to the highest bidder, and decisions were delayed as political actors spied on one another. In this context, fear stopped being an occasional tool and became a constant atmosphere. Fear of betrayal, fear of relatives, fear of speaking too much, of choosing the wrong alliances, of being accused of conspiracy. Even the Janissaries, that elite corps that had once fiercely defended the Sultan, began to change. They became a privileged group with their own interests, capable of influencing politics, overthrowing a sultan, or imposing conditions. The very guard meant to protect the empire became one of its most effective extortionists. And yet, despite all this, the empire remained standing. Because the scaffolding built over generations was still solid. Provincial administration remained efficient, the fiscal system still worked, and the trade routes remained active. But the inner flame, that expansive, innovative, and confident will, was beginning to fade. And it did so without fanfare, without major defeats, without catastrophic invasions. It faded from within, in the form of postponed decisions, avoided reforms, and a leadership that no longer led, only endured. Thus began a new era for the Ottoman Empire. Not one of immediate collapse, nor of spectacular ruin, but one of slow erosion. The empire that had once feared its enemies now feared its own sons. And in that paradox, it turned inward, hoping that the structure would be enough to sustain what the will could no longer propel forward. And as the halls of Topkapi filled with echoes of ancient decisions, beyond the walls, a new kind of threat was beginning to take shape. A threat that did not come with swords, but with books, maps, and telescopes. A silent threat that advanced from the West without uniforms, but with ideas that would forever change the balance of the world. The shadow of Europe grows without rest. In the early decades of the 17th century, while the Ottoman Empire still saw itself reflected in the mirrors of its glorious past, a silent transformation began to shift the balance of the world. It wasn't an enemy army crossing borders, nor an unexpected rebellion. It was something deeper, less visible, and therefore more dangerous: the unstoppable rise of Europe. On the other side of the continent, the Christian kingdoms were not merely rearming, they were reinventing themselves. In cities like Amsterdam, London, and Paris, ideas began to move faster than armies. Science advanced, universities expanded their influence, and merchants charted new routes that no longer depended on the Mediterranean or Ottoman permissions. The compass, the printing press, gunpowder organized into tactical formations, and modern finance were forging a civilization that was increasingly competitive, increasingly ambitious. Meanwhile, in Istanbul, the empire was looking inward. The throne continued to be occupied by sultans who, for the most part, had been raised behind the walls of the cafes, with no experience in governance and no real connection to the world beyond the palace. The imperial role, once a position of action and decision, had in many cases become a mask, upheld by officials and viziers who ruled from the shadows. And those viziers, though capable, could not work miracles with an empire that was beginning to fall behind. On the Western Front, war with Austria became a constant. The empire, which in the previous century had reached the gates of Vienna, began to lose ground. Military campaigns were no longer swift. They were drawn out, heavy, expensive. In 1683, the Ottomans once again attempted to take Vienna. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa marched with an imposing army, but underestimated the European response. The battle ended in disaster. Polish troops led by King John III Sobieski came to the city's aid and broke the siege with a cavalry charge still remembered as one of the most spectacular in military history. It was a psychological turning point. Europe no longer saw the Ottoman Empire as invincible. From that moment on, the retreat began. The Holy League, a coalition formed by Austria, Poland, Venice, and Russia, advanced on multiple fronts. In 1699, with the signing of the Treaty of Karlowitz, the empire ceded Hungary, Transylvania, and significant parts of the Balkans. It was the first time in centuries the Ottomans had officially acknowledged territorial losses of that magnitude. And beyond the borders, what hurt most was the symbolism. The era of expansionism had ended. But the threat was not only military. Europe's true shadow came wrapped in books, maps, and telescopes. While printing presses in Ottoman cities were still viewed with suspicion, for fear that religious texts might be profaned, Europe blossomed with scientific treatises, observatories, encyclopedias, and debates on philosophy, law, and political organization. The empire that for centuries had been the center of Islamic knowledge, home to the finest madrasas and Quranic schools, now clung to forms of knowledge that no longer responded to the demands of the modern world. The economy also began to crack. Traditional trade routes lost relevance compared to the oceanic circuits. The discovery of the Americas, the colonization of Asia and Africa, and maritime control of the Atlantic gave European powers an advantage the Ottomans did not know how, or did not want, to replicate. The Ottoman fleet, powerful in the 16th century, stagnated, and naval techniques failed to evolve at the necessary pace. At sea, as in science and industry, the empire seemed anchored to formulas that no longer worked. In addition, internal challenges emerged that further weakened the imperial structure. Provincial governors, the beylerbeys and valis, acted with increasing autonomy. Some collected taxes for their own purposes. Others raised private armies or struck deals with foreign enemies. The centralized unity that had characterized the empire at its height slowly unraveled, not with an explosion, but through gradual disintegration. And in the cities, daily life was also changing. Urban revolts multiplied. Artisans complained about inflation. Peasants fled to the cities in search of refuge, and the janissaries, no longer the disciplined elite feared by all, became an unpredictable force, involving themselves in street politics, disturbances, and blackmailing rulers. They were no longer a feared military corps, but a volatile group that demanded privileges and deposed sultans if necessary. In this context, reforms began to be proposed, but never managed to take root. Some viziers, inspired by what they saw in Europe, tried to introduce changes in the army, in taxation, in administration. But every attempt met resistance. From religious leaders who saw modernization as a threat to tradition, from janissaries who feared losing their status, and from courtiers who saw their networks of power at risk. And yet, the most tragic aspect was not the military setback, nor the technological lag, but the loss of confidence. The empire, which had once inspired fear, respect, even admiration, began to be seen as a motionless giant. And that perception seeped inward as well. The Ottomans began to distrust themselves, to repeat formulas that no longer worked, to gaze at the past with nostalgia instead of looking toward the future with ambition. Thus, the shadow of Europe did not fall upon the Ottoman Empire all at once. It slid in slowly, like a dimness creeping across a room without anyone noticing. And when they tried to light the lamp, they found the wick was damp, the oil rancid, and the flame no longer responded to the spark. And while that shadow continued to spread, within the empire there were still those who dreamed of recovering everything, who believed that with the right reforms, with the right momentum, it was possible to restore the state's former vitality. But for now, those dreams would remain just that, deferred ideas clashing against the walls of a reality increasingly worn down. The centuries of resistance and failed reforms. In the final years of the 17th century and throughout much of the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire lived in a delicate balance between resignation and a constant, almost desperate effort to recover lost time. It was not a free fall, nor an evident ruin at first glance, but rather a persistent erosion, a sense that everything was a bit more rusted than before, a bit slower, heavier, and at the same time that it was urgent to do something to stop the decay. Some sectors of the imperial elite began to look westward with less disdain and more unease. What for centuries had been seen as inferior, the customs of Europe, its armies, its thinking, was beginning to be perceived as a structural threat. It was no longer about crusades or border wars, but cultural, scientific, and administrative transformations that were pushing the world toward new forms of power. And the empire, though vast, seemed increasingly alien to those dynamics. That was when the first major reform attempts emerged. One of the most remembered took place during the so-called Tulip period, in the early decades of the 18th century. Under the reign of Ahmed III, Istanbul experienced a brief moment of aesthetic, social, and technological modernization. European-style gardens were introduced, public festivities were celebrated, the first Ottoman printing press was founded, though it faced strong religious resistance. And ambassadors were sent to France to learn about architecture, art, and administration. But that modernity, decorated with flowers and poetry, failed to penetrate the hardened structures of power. It was, rather, a shiny surface on a building that needed a complete renovation. The opposition of the more conservative sectors was quick to react, and the Janissaries, those soldiers who had long been more political than military, led a revolt that destroyed much of what had been achieved. The printing press was shut down. The reformists were dismissed or executed. The empire returned to the rhythm of the familiar, of the safe, even if that rhythm no longer matched the pace of the world. Despite these failures, the ideas persisted, and over the decades, the sultans began to understand that the only way to preserve something of the old order was by transforming it. One key moment came with the reign of Selim III at the end of the 18th century. Inspired by Napoleonic reforms and European military models, Selim launched an ambitious modernization program. He reorganized the army, founded technical academies, sought new diplomatic alliances, and tried to reduce the power of the Janissaries. But it was precisely that power that destroyed him. The Janissaries, feeling threatened by military professionalization, rebelled. They captured the Sultan, overthrew him, and after a brief period of chaos, murdered him in his cell. The message was clear. Any deep reform would be met with violence. The old order still had enough strength to defend itself against change, and yet the need for reform did not disappear. On the contrary, it became more urgent with each passing year, because the international context did not stand still. France was in revolution. England was multiplying factories. Russia was expanding its empire into the Caucasus and the Balkans. And in the heart of the Islamic world, the Ottoman Empire seemed to spin in circles, trapped between what it once was and what it no longer knew how to become. At the beginning of the 19th century, Mahmud II ascended to the throne, a sultan who understood that the time for half measures was over. For years, he pretended to yield to the Janissaries, concealed his intentions, and built discreet alliances. And then, in the year 1826, he struck the final blow. He ordered the massacre of thousands of Janissaries in Istanbul, eliminating once and for all the military corps that for centuries had both sustained and paralyzed the empire. That purge, brutal and decisive, opened the doors for a new wave of reforms. Mahmud reorganized the administration, centralized fiscal control, sent emissaries to Europe to copy institutional models, and even changed the official attire of officials, replacing the turban with the fez as a symbol of a new era. It was a way of saying, we are entering a different time, and we must resemble the world around us. But it was not easy. The provinces, accustomed to autonomy, resisted central control. Ethnic and religious minorities, influenced by European nationalism, began to question their place within the empire. And foreign powers, Russia, France, and England, competed for influence over internal Ottoman affairs with relentless cynicism. Every attempt at modernization faced internal and external obstacles that turned each step into a struggle. The idea that the empire could regenerate itself from within was still alive, but it was evident that the margin was narrowing. The 19th century, which for Europe was a period of expansion, industrialization, and conquest, was for the Ottoman Empire a century of constant resistance. Resistance to fragmentation, resistance to European powers, resistance to nationalism, resistance to bankruptcy, resistance to irrelevance. But in that resistance, the cost was immense. Dynamism was lost, confidence was lost, and what remained of the old splendor began to feel like a distant memory, fed more by nostalgia than by reality. With each passing decade, the empire seemed more surrounded, more pressured, more vulnerable. It had learned to survive everything: wars, betrayals, revolutions, but could not find a way to be reborn, because that was what it needed: a new way of being. It was not enough to reform the facade. The very architecture needed to be transformed, and that challenge, the most complex of all, still remained unresolved. In the capitals of Europe, diplomats looked at the Ottoman Empire with a mix of compassion and calculation. They knew it was still a key piece on the board, but they also knew it was wounded. Some sought to prop it up to contain others, while others were already looking for ways to divide it. The expression, "the sick man of Europe," began to echo in the corridors of power, and although it was not spoken aloud in Istanbul, it felt like a persistent shadow over every decision, over every reform. And while reforms kept stumbling, while the ancient structures refused to die, external pressure became ever more suffocating. The empire no longer set the pace of the world. It followed it with difficulty, like someone chasing a train that has already departed. And yet, within that impossible race, there were still those who dreamed of rebuilding the empire, of giving it back its soul, its strength, its center. But for such an ancient body to breathe again, it is not enough to heal the wounds. One must give it back its heart. And in that longing, in that struggle to stay alive in a world that no longer followed its logic, the Ottoman Empire would enter its last great transformation, a phase where modernity would no longer be a choice, but a matter of survival. The long Ottoman autumn. For the Ottoman Empire, the 19th century was like a season that lasted longer than nature intended. An endless autumn where the leaves kept falling slowly while the tree refused to die. There was no resounding collapse or sudden downfall, but rather a decline full of pauses, an administrative melancholy, a mysterious ability to keep existing when everything suggested it should have already ceased to do so. And at the center of that silent resistance stands a figure, Abdülhamid II, a sultan who understood that power, when it can no longer be imposed with armies, must be upheld through vigilance, cunning, and control. His rise to the throne in 1876 was turbulent from the outset. He inherited an empire exhausted by wars with Russia, neck-deep in debt to European powers, and torn apart by nationalist movements that sought to rip apart the seams of a structure too old to contain them. Despite all this, or perhaps because of it, Abdülhamid became a master of balance. He ruled with distrust, pragmatism, and above all, with an obsession for controlling information. He implemented a network of spies that reached even the most remote provinces, kept his ministers under surveillance, censored the press, and monitored European ambassadors constantly. His reign was a mixture of paranoia and political intelligence, of fear and discreet modernization. On the world map, the Ottoman Empire still occupied a vast space. It covered the Balkans, Anatolia, the Levant, Mesopotamia, and the Arabian Peninsula. But in practice, that vastness was deceptive. Many regions were under de facto autonomy. Others depended on treaties with European powers. Even the empire's own finances were managed by an international commission overseeing the repayment of foreign debt. It was, quite literally, a mortgaged empire. Even so, the Sultan was not indifferent to the need for change. Under his supervision, new railway lines were built, including the famous Hejaz Railway that connected Damascus with Medina. Technical schools were created, military academies were strengthened, and the use of the telegraph was promoted to accelerate communication between provinces. All of this coexisted with fierce repression. Liberal ideas were suffocated, newspapers were shut down overnight, and critical intellectuals either disappeared or ended up in exile. This duality between technical modernization and political stagnation defined the long Ottoman autumn. The empire was learning to use the tools of the 19th century but refused to adopt its principles. It rejected constitutionalism, genuine parliamentarianism, and freedom of the press. It continued to rely on absolute power, on the cult of the Sultan as the guarantor of order. And in a world that was moving faster and faster, that stillness disguised as firmness was becoming deadly. Meanwhile, nationalism kept growing like a wound that would not heal. The peoples of the Balkans, inspired by European independence movements, organized, conspired, and waited for the opportune moment. The Greeks had already gained independence decades earlier. The Serbs, Bulgarians, and Albanians pushed harder every year. Revolts were frequent, and although the Ottoman army continued to crush them, the political and human cost of each repression was increasingly high. Europe, for its part, watched the decline with a mix of superiority and greed. The great powers benefited from the slow Ottoman unraveling. Russia pressed for control of the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits. Britain defended its influence over Egypt and the Suez Canal. France claimed protectorates over Christians in Lebanon and Syria. Germany, a newer player in the imperial game, sought to associate with Istanbul through military and commercial agreements. Each pulled at a corner of the map, as if the empire were already a corpse up for grabs. In this context, Sultan Abdul Hamid became a contradictory symbol. For some, he was the last great defender of Islamic unity against European colonialism. For others, an outdated despot who had lost touch with reality. His appeal to pan-Islamism, the idea of uniting all Muslims under his religious authority, was both a spiritual and geopolitical strategy. He tried to strengthen his role as caliph, gaining support across the Islamic world beyond the empire's political borders. But even that was not enough to halt the fragmentation. By the end of the century, internal tensions had become unbearable. A group of young officers, intellectuals, and bureaucrats began conspiring in secret. They were the so-called Young Turks. They believed in the urgent need to reform the state, establish a real constitution, modernize the administration, and above all, put an end to absolutism. In 1908, they achieved their goal. They led a revolution that forced Abdul Hamid to restore the constitution he himself had suspended decades earlier. The following year, they deposed him and sent him into exile. The old lion of the throne fell without a roar. But the Sultan's departure did not solve the empire's problems. It remained a geopolitical puzzle, a fragile structure on the verge of breaking apart. The Young Turks, now in power, launched a new round of reforms but faced a turbulent landscape. The Balkan Wars began to strip the empire of its European territories. In just 2 years, regions that had been under Ottoman sovereignty for centuries were lost. These defeats were not symbolic. They were real, painful, and bloody amputations. And yet, the empire did not collapse entirely. It kept breathing, as if each blow were absorbed by a millennia-old inertia. Train lines still operated. Government offices continued stamping decrees. Merchants crossed the streets of Istanbul, and the call to prayer continued to mark the rhythm of daily life. But that life was dimmer, more uncertain, more closely watched. The long Ottoman autumn was a time of contradictions, of partial advances and deep setbacks, of modernity without democracy, of order without stability. It was a period in which the empire tried to adapt to the 20th century without having yet resolved the debts of the 18th. and that accumulated burden was preparing it for an inevitable ending. Because what lay ahead was no longer reform, transition, or diplomacy. What was coming was a total storm, a cataclysm that would sweep the entire world. And in that storm, the Ottoman Empire, having withstood centuries of conflict, would face its ultimate test. A war that would no longer be about provinces or reforms, but about existence itself. The storm of the Great War. In the summer of 1914, the world was approaching the edge without knowing it. A bullet fired in Sarajevo would not only pierce the chest of an archduke, but also the heart of 4 empires, and among them, the oldest, the most improbable of all, the Ottoman Empire, was preparing to face its last great storm. It did not know this for certain, but it sensed it. Because this was no longer about defending a border or quelling a revolt. This time, it was history itself that trembled. The empire had weakened. The Balkan Wars had been a disaster. Territories that had remained under Ottoman control for centuries were lost in a matter of months. The army was decimated, poorly equipped, and fragmented among factions. The people were exhausted, and the leaders were divided between those who wanted to remain neutral and those who sought a desperate alliance to give the state some oxygen. Among the latter, the will of Enver Pasha prevailed, one of the strongmen of the triumvirate known as the Young Turks. Convinced that the war would be short and that Germany would win quickly, Enver decided this was the moment to place the Ottoman Empire back at the center of world affairs. In October of 1914, without waiting for formal authorization, he ordered a naval attack against Russian ports in the Black Sea. The bold and reckless move sealed the Ottoman fate. It officially joined the Central Powers, alongside Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Entry into the war was not a military decision. It was an existential gamble. If they won, perhaps the empire could regain its prestige and some of its lost territories. If they lost, the price would be far greater than any battle. Because the world was now different. There was no more room for fragile empires sustained by past glories. Modern war had no patience for states that survived out of habit. It was a war of machines, of steel, of relentless logistics. And the Ottoman Empire, despite its reforms, still dragged the ghosts of the previous century. The military campaigns were brutal. On the Caucasus front, Ottoman troops suffered one of the most catastrophic defeats in their history. Enver Pasha, who personally led the army, underestimated the weather conditions and overestimated the preparedness of his men. Tens of thousands died frozen in the mountains. The disaster was not only tactical, it was symbolic. It revealed that confidence could not replace preparation, and that heroism was no substitute for strategy. In Mesopotamia, the British advanced from India. In the Sinai and Palestine, the fight grew increasingly complex. But it would be in the Dardanelles, on the Gallipoli Peninsula, where the empire would play one of its most unexpected cards. The Allied powers tried to force their way to Istanbul through the strait. It was an ambitious maneuver, designed to strangle the empire from the sea. But the Ottoman troops resisted with fierce tenacity. Under the command of officers like Mustafa Kemal, a name not yet well known but one that would soon change history, the defenders repelled an invasion that had seemed inevitable. Gallipoli became a symbol of national pride, a shining exception amid general collapse. It proved that spirit still beat in the heart of the empire. But that victory could not hide the rest of the landscape. Defeats piled up. The Allies closed in from multiple fronts, and within the empire, even darker tragedies began to unfold. During this period, one of the deepest wounds of the century was unleashed: the Armenian genocide. The Ottoman authorities, under the pretext of a supposed alliance between the Armenians and Russia, began to deport and massacre hundreds of thousands of people. Entire families were forced to march through the desert. Towns were wiped off the map. The Armenian population of the empire was decimated. To this day, this tragedy still divides opinions, but historical facts, testimonies, and archives speak with a voice that cannot be silenced. It was a systematic crime, an ethnic cleansing masked by the language of national security. Meanwhile, in the Arabian desert, a new revolt was gaining strength. British imperialism, skilled at exploiting internal resentments, supported Arab leaders seeking to free themselves from Ottoman rule. There, among caravans and oases, appeared the almost mythical figure of Lawrence of Arabia, a British officer who helped organize a tribal rebellion that dismantled Ottoman supply routes and struck at the prestige of Istanbul as the center of Islam. The idea of an Ottoman caliphate no longer united all Muslims. On the contrary, in many places it was seen as oppression. In 1918, after 4 years of brutal attrition, the empire signed the Armistice of Mudros. There was no room left to resist. The cities were empty of young men. The economy had collapsed. Morale was on the floor. And worse still, the victorious powers had already begun to negotiate the partition of what remained of the Ottoman state as if it were a prize. Syria and Lebanon would be administered by France, Palestine, Iraq, and Transjordan by the British. Greece claimed Izmir. Armenia dreamed of independence. Kurds, Arabs, Bulgarians, Albanians, all wanted their share of what had once been a whole. Istanbul was occupied by Allied troops. The Sultan, weakened, signed humiliating treaties that practically dismantled what remained of the empire. In the streets, the people no longer knew whether to obey the palace or look toward another horizon. And in that chaos, in that fog of defeat, a new leadership began to emerge. A leadership that did not come from the throne, but from the trenches, from the resistance, from a will no longer seeking to save the empire, but to build something else. The war had ended. But what came next would not be peace, but the final reckoning. Because an empire can survive many battles, but it cannot survive losing its purpose. And that, in the end, was what had been lost. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire had defined itself by its expansion, by its centrality, by its role in the world. Now it was no longer the center of anything, just a shadow on the maps, awaiting its final sentence. The end of an empire, the birth of Turkey. When an empire falls, it rarely does so with a dry, definitive crash. What usually happens is a slow erosion, a gradual evaporation of power that stretches over years, sometimes even generations. But in the case of the Ottoman Empire, the final fall, although preceded by decades of decline, ended in a clear, symbolic, and irrevocable act: the abolition of the Sultanate. Not a war, not an assassination, not an invasion, but a signature, a political declaration, a rupture with everything that had once been. After the disaster of the Great War, what remained of the former empire was little more than a legal fiction sustained by foreign powers. Istanbul was still occupied by British, French, and Italian troops. Sultan Mehmed VI, weakened, unpopular, and without real authority, accepted the demands of the victors without being able to defend the territory that, on the maps, he still appeared to rule. But beyond the palace halls, something new was taking shape. Something that did not obey the past, but was born from fire, exile, and war. Mustafa Kemal, an officer of the Ottoman army who had proven his mettle at Gallipoli, decided that the fate of the country could no longer remain in the hands of those who had led it to the abyss. From Ankara, then a nondescript city, he began organizing a national movement. It was not merely a military rebellion, it was an ideological revolution. What he proposed was not to save the empire, but to build a new nation from its ruins. A Turkish nation, secular, modern, unified, free from the old pacts, from the old hierarchies, from the old shadows. The path was not easy. In the interior of the country, there were still regions that resisted change. Abroad, peace treaties were already dividing Anatolia among the victors. Greece had occupied Smyrna with British support. France and Armenia had advanced through the southeast. Even Italy wanted a piece of the pie. But the Liberation Army, under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal, organized a resistance that combined military strategy with a renewed discourse. They did not fight for the Sultan, nor for political Islam. They fought for popular sovereignty, for lost dignity. The War of Independence lasted until the year 1923. It was intense, chaotic, and bloody, but it was effective. One by one, the enemies were driven out. The European powers, worn out by their own fronts, began to retreat. Greece, after an initially successful offensive, suffered a devastating defeat that culminated in the evacuation of Smyrna and the fire that razed the city, leaving scars that still burn in the collective memory. And while the Turkish flag rose over the ruins of the empire, the final gesture took place in Istanbul. The national parliament, gathered in Ankara, declared the Sultanate abolished on the 1st of November of the year 1922. Mehmed VI fled the Topkapi Palace on a British ship, escorted like a graceful prisoner, exiled without dignity or legacy. He was no longer a sultan. He was nothing. The final link in 6 centuries of absolute power dissolved among the waves of the Bosphorus. But the rupture went even deeper. In the year 1924, the caliphate was also abolished. That symbolic figure that for centuries had served as the connection between Islam and Ottoman power. Kemal understood that a new republic could not build its future with the symbols of the past. Eliminating the monarch was not enough. The entire mindset of the state had to be reconfigured, and he did so with astonishing speed. In just a few years, Turkey adopted a new constitution, literacy in Latin characters, a radical separation between religion and state, and an independent, pragmatic, and calculated foreign policy. The Republic of Turkey was officially born on the 29th of October of the year 1923. It was the end, yes, but also the beginning. And like every true beginning, it came with pain. There were forced displacements, population exchanges, cultural cleansing, and identity redefinition. Millions of Orthodox Greeks left Anatolia. Hundreds of thousands of Muslims arrived from the Balkans. The map was redrawn with violence, urgency, and ambition. But despite everything, what prevailed was a new way of seeing the world. Turkey ceased to be the center of an Islamic empire and became a modern nation-state. It no longer aspired to control other regions or to represent foreign peoples. It aspired simply to govern itself. And in that renunciation of empire, there was an affirmation of the future. When seen in perspective, the disappearance of the Ottoman Empire is one of the most profound transformations of the 20th century. Not only because of the territorial magnitude of what was lost, but also because of the change in paradigm. It was the last great medieval structure to vanish. The last to maintain a theocratic, hereditary, and expansive model. Its fall marked the end of an era, and the beginning of a world governed by other logics, those of nation-states, civil rights, global capitalism, and fixed borders. And yet, the Ottoman ghost still floats in the consciousness of many peoples, because it was an empire of centuries, with an indelible mark. In the Balkans, in the Arab world, in the Caucasus, in North Africa. The echoes of that structure are still felt. The mosques, the names, the customs, the memories. In Istanbul, you can still walk through alleys, where the walls whisper stories of eunuchs, viziers, sultans, and European ambassadors negotiating in marble courtyards. Memory does not disappear with a decree. It transforms. It seeps through. It survives in the cracks. Thus, the Ottoman Empire came to an end. Not as it began, with horsemen crossing the Bosphorus under green banners, nor with cannons toppling the walls of Constantinople, but with a parliamentary act, with an official renunciation, with a soldier who became a statesman and decided it was time to close the book. a book that had begun 700 years earlier, in a corner of Anatolia, and that now, with all its complexity, was left in the hands of history. And perhaps the most surprising thing of all is that although the empire died, its legacy is still alive. Not as a power, but as a question. What remains when everything changes? What is left when a world disappears? Perhaps what remains is what we are doing now. Looking back, remembering, understanding. Because only then, the past does not drag us down, but teaches us how to move forward. Thank you for accompanying me to the end of this journey through the centuries of the Ottoman Empire. If you have made it this far, it is because this story has touched you in some way. I would love to read what you think. Leave me a comment, share your favorite part, or that surprising fact that caught your attention. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because there are still many civilizations left to discover. Good night.